to you, everyone, wherever in the part of the world you might be based right now. I say good day. Thank you very much, and you're welcome to today's program. Today, we are gathered to talk about a book, but not only just to talk about the book, but also to celebrate this very fantastic and incredible work of labor that went into this magnificent work. And today we are going to be bringing up the authors of this book. They have a set of panelists and audience, and we will see or have today. All right, so first I welcome everyone today. And I must start with our authors, the reason why we have all gathered here today, the authors of this fantastic book titled Women in Africa. I have read this book, and I must say that I'm really excited about what today will look like for all of us. So first, I must thank our authors, the two of them. First is Dr. Olajumoke Yacob Haliso, who is a distinguished scholar and who has contributed significantly to our understanding of African women from politics to social culture. And this is another wonderful project that she has given us. And the second person, the second author, is Professor Toyin Falola, who needs no introduction. He's the kind of person that Yoruba say that you already know him the way you know money, right? We can all recognize money. And so, yes, we already know you. Professor Falola is also welcome. And so today we will be talking about this book, which is I'm going to keep using adjectives, a fantastic compendium of African women in history and culture. The book is vast in its scope. It is deep in the breadth of its research and entirely thoughtful in the methodological means that it employs. It's covered wide historical ground, and it's also a thoughtful reflection on the phenomenon of women through an extensive historical period. It is a great achievement, and the authors are worth celebrating for the work that they did here. I must confess that the book left me breathless for the range of subjects it covered, right, from history to social culture to contemporary politics, industry, technology, and even speculating about the future. That is a fascinating work. And it's impressive how they were able to bring such disparate topics together under a coherent umbrella. It is, I think, I will say it's a testament, to their wide-ranging ability, commitment to social causes, and dedication to high scholarly standards that they could pull off this extensive project successfully. And so we welcome these two authors who will go today. And we also welcome our panelists. We have 6 of them, also very distinguished women, and we'll get to know them in 1 minute as we go through each person. They will get to have an opening statement where they introduce themselves to the audience and also talk about their research, their great contributions to the world. And so I will start with, as they are arranged in front of me by Zoom, I will go we'll go in this order. First will be Professor Agbalajobi, followed by Professor Khushi Singh Rathore, and followed by Professor Tinuade Ojo, followed by Professor Mary Owusu. Then we go to Professor Grace Idahosa, and finally we come to Professor Christine Vogt-William. So please give us your opening statements, one after the other. Thank you.
Good day, everyone. My name is Damilola Taiye Agbalajobi. I'm a professor of political science at Obafemi Awolowo University, Nigeria. My academic and professional journey has been deeply rooted in the intersection of gender, governance, peace building, and political participation in Africa. I had a PhD in political science from the University of Lagos. My research has consistently focused on women's political representation, gender dimension of conflict, and inclusive governance. I have authored the book Promoting Gender Equality in Political Participation in Perspective on Nigeria, and contributed to numerous scholarly work, including chapters on African women in politics, peace building, and gender victimhood in conflict zones. Beyond academia, I serve as a principal investigator and research associate on several national and international projects, including those funded by TED Fund, FCDO, and Institute of Development Studies, focusing on political inclusion, urban governance, and gender leadership in fragile contexts. Today, I'm greatly honored to contribute to this important conversation by discussing this book and basically focusing on chapter 18 and 19, which explores the resilience, the agency, and transformative roles of African women in politics and peace building. These themes are not only central to my research, but also to the broader struggle for equity and justice across the continent. On my personal reflection, my passion for this field was ignited when I saw ambitious women sidelined by invisible barriers. Through field research and interviews across West Africa, I witnessed how targeted policies and mentorship can actually unlock leadership potential. Writing my book deepened my conviction that sustainable change requires both systemic reform and community-level engagement. My distinguished panelists, guests, panelists and other guests, it is my great honor to join you today in exploring the theme Women in Africa Global Perspective as the book is launched. Drawing on my work in promoting gender equality in political participation, I will highlight both the strides you have made and the obstacles that remain on the path to full inclusion of African women in political life by examining the historical revolution, sharing success stories, and proposing actionable reforms. I hope to spark a conversation that moves beyond numbers to real transformation, and I count it a great honor to be here this day. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Agbalajobi. Now we go to Professor Rathore.
Thank you so much. My name is Khushi. I have completed my PhD from Jawaharlal Nehru University, New Delhi, India. My PhD was on in international politics, and I work on women's diplomatic history and the intersections of gender in diplomacy and feminist foreign policy. And I'm particularly invested in the period of decolonization and the projects of world making at that point of time, because that was the window that opened and shut rapidly, as Ali Raza, a Pakistani historian, tells us. And most of my work is devoted to that. At this moment, I am in Italy. I have just arrived here 2 weeks ago to start my postdoctoral fellowship at the European University Institute. Here I'm affiliated to the Department of History and the Robert Schuman Center for Advanced Studies. And I'm working on a project which is an extension of my thesis and something which hopefully will probably be my work for a very long time, not just for 2 years. That's the duration that I'm here for. And it's called Post-Colonial Diplomacy and the Idea of Asia, where again, I'm investigating and trying to unwrap these ideas of the international in those moments of radical imagination. And I'm really honored to be on this panel. I have worked with Professor Jakob Haliso as a member of the Feminist Theory and Gender Studies section of the International Studies Association. And it's such an incredible honor to have the opportunity also to engage with a work, as you rightly said, which is so deep and so vast, and which gives us so much to think with. So yes, these would be my opening remarks. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Professor Rathore, and congratulations on everything you've achieved so far. And we look forward to reading your work when you come down. Thank you. Professor Ojo, over to you now.
Thank you so much. Good evening, distinguished guests, to the organizers, colleagues, and friends. Thank you so much for having me on this podium. My name is Tinuade Ojo. I am an associate professor at the Department of Politics and International Relations at University of Johannesburg, and also the director for the Center for Race, Gender, and Class at the university. As a feminist political economist, my research spans from various and several research niches, centering purposefully on political and economic systems. My scholarship has focused on different themes, such as financial inclusion, women and governance, economic justice, climate change, gender-based violence, migration, women political leadership, and so on and so forth, which is grounded in social justice and sustainability. Currently, I'm also serving as a co-lead for the Task Force 4 for the T20 on solidarity and sustainable development goals for the upcoming G20 that South Africa is hosting. And I've been offering my expert guidance as a team on gender equity, inclusive governance, and transformative policy solutions at both the continental and the global level. I'm going to echo with my colleagues to say that I'm honored to be part of this important dialogue and book that is being launched today on women in Africa. It's quite amazing to see the amazing work that I've gone through the spectrum of the theme in itself. So I would really appreciate the vision and leadership of Professor Toyin Falola and Professor Jumoke Yakubaliso for curating such an extraordinary body of work. Their commitment to centering African women's lived realities and intellectual contributions has really given us a text, that is both prolific in scope and profound in its significance. And I look forward to the discourse as we move on today. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Professor Ojo. We're truly honored to have you here with us. Thank you for coming.
Thank you.
Professor Owusu.
Thank you. As everyone has said before, I'm so happy to be here, and I thank Professor Toyin Falola and Professor Yakubaliso for writing this book that gives all of us an in to discuss women in global perspectives. A little comment on the book I'll make is that I found that the book gives you an in into so many research fields when it comes to African women and our lives and histories. And it is great as a historian when I think of it in terms of historiography, the writing of African history and African women's history. As a researcher, that is my specialty. I specialize in Ghanaian and African intellectual history and historiography. And so I am very interested in methodology and very interested in pedagogy, how history is taught. Currently, I am broadening my scope. In fact, when the professors ahead of me spoke, I realized that I am probably the one person who entered the field of women's work late. In fact, when I started off, I never really wanted to do women. At that time, I thought that doing women was limiting myself. So I did other things. And now I've come full circle and I've realized that women's history, women's work is integral to what we study, no matter our discipline. And so today I am researching in African intellectual history, women's work as female intellectuals. And I am focusing on 8 Ghanaian women. I'm trying to do a prosopography for the 8 of them. I think as we speak today, a lot of what I'm doing now will emerge. Thank you very much for having me.
Oh, thank you very much, Professor Owusu, and thank you very much for your wonderful contributions to the field of women's studies. We are really glad to have you. Professor Grace Idahosa, you're welcome.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. Good day, everyone. It is a pleasure to be here to discuss Professor Yakubaliso and Professor Falola's impressive and timely book. As everyone has said, it is vast and covers different aspects of women's experience. It is a comprehensive and vital text, I think. And it serves as a cornerstone for anyone who wants to do gender on the continent. As been said, I am Grace Idahosa. I am an assistant professor of education and social justice at the University of Cambridge. I am also a fellow and serve as Director of Studies for Education at Gonville and Keys College, which is part of Cambridge. Alongside my Cambridge role, I'm also a research fellow at the Center for Social Change at the University of Johannesburg in South Africa. My work is kind of interdisciplinary in nature because I have a PhD in politics and international relations, but my work is really focused on the politics of higher education transformation. There, I draw on feminist epistemologies and decolonial thoughts to explore the conditions that enable or constrain human agency, particularly within contexts or within systems that are structurally unequal. So a lot of my work really emerged within the South African context. Since then, I've explored agency within post-conflict contexts like Northern Ireland and also within contexts like India. So much of my research really centers on the higher education context as a site of both oppression and possibility. I am also interested in the intersectional politics of transformation, so how race, class, gender, sexuality, and institutional power interact to shape and create space for meaningful change, but also acknowledging that within these spaces, change is resisted. These interests are examined in my book titled Agency and Social Transformation in South African Higher Education, Pushing the Bounds of Possibility. And in that monograph, I examine how South African universities, particularly academics within those institutions, navigated transformation in post-apartheid era, and what this teaches us about the broader politics of transformation. Beyond the book, my research also spans the themes of decolonization, body politics, intersectionality, the experiences of first-generation women and experiences of Black women in STEM fields, particularly focused on post-conflict and post-colonial contexts. I've also written about women in leadership roles and how they are often constrained by structural conditions and hierarchies and norms that are designed to exclude or mark their bodies out of place. And at present, I'm leading several projects. I won't go into all of that because it feels like I've been talking for a long time now. One of the most exciting one is a research and podcast initiative on the experiences of Black professors in England, which is funded by the Cambridge Humanities Research Grant. And the goal of the project is to amplify voices of Black professors, voices that are often marginalized in public and academic discourse, and to create a kind of an archive of counter narratives about race, power, and knowledge within the higher education context. I'll wrap up and say across my work, my commitment is to politically engaged scholarship. I see research as inseparable from social justice, and I strive to connect my academic work with the broader struggles for equity and transformation within the higher education context in South Africa, in UK, and beyond. And I draw particularly from my talk today on this research to engage for key chapters on colonialism, apartheid, education, and racism. And I really look forward to a fruitful dialogue and engagement with the panelists and also with the authors. That's it for me.
Yeah, thank you very much, Professor Idahosa. I look forward to the engagement that will come to very shortly. Thank you. And finally, Professor Christine Williams.
Hi, hello, good evening. It is a privilege and a pleasure to be here with all of you. As said, my name is Christine Vogt-William, and I am an English and American literary and cultural studies scholar working predominantly in the transdisciplinary field of gender studies, as well as in post-colonial and decolonial studies. For the past 6.5 years, I have held the position of Director of Gender and Diversity at the Africa Multiple Cluster at the University of Bayreuth here in Germany. This cluster is funded by the German Research Council. The cluster's declared vision and mission is the reconfiguring of African studies, doing African studies with African scholars. The Gender and Diversity Office, or GDO, is just one key pillar in this cluster to drive this agenda forward. As director, I've basically implemented intersectionality theory, critical diversity literacy, and decolonial scholarship by predominantly African and other Global South identifying scholars in my toolbox to do this valuable work.
All three fields from which I draw valuable principles to shape my work in the arenas of structural policy work as well as epistemic engagements share significant and productive overlaps to generate complex lenses of interrogation directed on the African studies research agendas that I encounter in the context of the cluster work. The GDO is situated at the interface of structural administration and research complexities, which include disciplinary engagements in research and teaching, interpersonal relations between global North and global South research positionalities, early career and established scholarly positionalities, institutional and international research relationalities, institutional and greater socio-political contexts. So a couple of my publications which might be relevant would be my 2022 co-authored article with Rüdiger Sesemann and Sabelo Ndlovu-Gatsheni entitled African Studies in Distress, German Scholarship on Africa and the Neglected Challenge of Decoloniality, published in Africa Spectrum. And another one would be the Staying with the Trouble, Decolonial Care and Intersectional Responsibility in Knowledge Production in COVID-19 Times, published in the volume COVID-19 in Africa, Societal and Economic Implications, which was published with Palgrave Macmillan in 2023. Another publication from 2023 would be Reconfiguring African Studies, Reconfiguring Economics, Centering Intersectionality and Social Stratification, co-authored with Stefan Uma, Franklin Obeng Udom, Abena Udoru, Tanita Lewis, Leboang Japolo, Feko, Sarah Stefano, and Ingrid Kwan-Greven. This was published in Critical African Studies. And a 2024 publication also co-authored with several African feminist scholars, amongst them Fatoumata Badini Kinda, Evelyn Compaore Savadogo, Catherine Kiprop, Tandon Giovanni, and Ndidi Zadomi. It's entitled The Value of Critical Diversity in African Studies, a Transdisciplinary Conversation Among Gender Scholars. And this is a compendium of essays, a festschrift to honor Professor Badini Kinda Fatoumata. It's entitled Genre, Société et Développement en Afrique. Forgive my French. So these are some of my, shall we say, more expansive engagements at the textual level. In the course of my work, I consider not just gender parity in research or demographics, but also how current disciplinary cultures in the transdisciplinary field of African studies engage in modes of reflection on the coloniality of power in knowledge production processes, which require, among other things, a recognition of the African knowledge archive from the continent itself as being implemented in producing knowledges about African life worlds, politics, perspectives. In my endeavors, I've identified the importance of African feminist epistologies and their contributions towards the production of knowledge in an African studies pertinent to the 21st century. Against this backdrop, this particular book, Women in Africa, is a highly relevant volume of work which is conducive for research and teaching in African studies itself. The topics which are identified in the volume, which will be addressed in our conversation today, are valuable frames of discussing African women's knowledge production necessary for the revisioning and reconfiguring of African studies. Indeed, it is a godsend. My sincere thanks to Professor Toyin Falola, my sincere thanks to my sister, Professor Ola Jumoke Jacob Haliso, who's been so gracious and generous in including me in such conversations. It is a pleasure to misbehave with both of you. Thank you. For me, an important characteristic which I believe is noteworthy, and this is something that appealed to the teacher in me. I am an educator and it is a passion of mine. For me, this important characteristic is that little box of study questions at the end of each chapter. And this allows for a conscious and reflective engagement with the materials that have been set out. And as been said by my colleagues who spoke previously, there is a depth, a breadth, and a vast body of knowledge built on at least 60 to 70 years of knowledge by African feminists and other global South scholars. Let us not forget that great tradition. In this sense, I bow to our intellectual ancestors, and I'm extremely grateful for the teachings and the thoughts to be shared here this evening. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Professor Vogt-William. You're very correct. This is a really vast work. And while reading it, I kept looking at it and thinking, like, how long did this book take them to work on? How many years do you need to carry out such an extensive work? It is that breathtaking in its scope, and I'm really, really glad. And also what excites me is also you are panelists. The 6 of you represent different disciplines, different areas of strength, different research interests, regions, and even activist work. And I think that this kind of extensive strength is very valuable to tackling such a huge work like this. And so at this point, we are going to go into the next phase of the program, which is where each of us get to discuss the book and also throw some questions at the authors. And this is the point where Professor Falola and Dr. Yacob Haliso, who have always been the teachers, get to be questioned. And that is really an exciting prospect to watch people who sit on this side of the program be on the other side and answer questions. So I'm really looking forward to what that will look like today. And so again, we go in the same order, which we just did now. We start with Professor Agbalajobi, and then we'll move to Professor Rathore, Professor Ojo, Professor Owusu, Professor Idahosa, and then we'll come back to you, Professor Vogt-William. Thank you very much. So Professor Agbalajobi, you are up now.
Once again, thank you very much. I want to sincerely appreciate Professor Haliso and Professor Toyin Falola for the great honor to discuss. Yes, I really don't know where to start from, but I said I was looking at chapter 18 and chapter 19 because it has so much relevance to the work I do. But there are more questions I have because even when we're prepared, when I joined at 4 o'clock, I saw that there are a lot of questions, but there are a lot of answers already in the book. But notwithstanding, there's still a lot of questions that we can ask. The book has done immensely. For me, it's a good teaching material for my students, and I'm glad. I didn't know I was going to be having this opportunity, so I'm glad. But then I felt it's important for us to be able to look at trace, pre-colonial participation and colonial disruption. Let's start from there. The book has actually mentioned all the pre-colonial societies. Women held formal political roles, queens, princesses, yeah, there. And the colonial land policies in Nigeria kind of vested controls in male chiefs, and kind of things changed. But then colonial administration barred women from formal councils, all that. But post-independence milestones happened. Early 60s, we had begun to see appointment of first female ministers. And then a couple of change began. Then we have contemporary representativeness changing because of quotas were introduced, Rwanda. And as of today, we have a lot of things happening. As of 2024, we have about 41 African countries have implemented some forms of gender quotas at national or local level. That is progress for women. I don't know, for example. And then we have some colonial legacies and post-independent dynamics actually happening from the book, actually, that I said. And then colonial administration restructured economies to favor men in cash crop production and things like that. But many post-independent constitutions were gender blind. And of course, we see the effects in our society. And then we had issues of barriers to entry. And the book actually examined some of the entrenched patriarchy and social norms that actually limits women's access to political networks. And they discuss economic constraints, including campaign and other stuff. And then those patriarchy norms across Africa rigidly separate public and private spheres, confining women to domestic roles and so forth. But then, when I was doing this reading, I came across a post on the 8th of September where I was prepared for this panel. And there was a post on LinkedIn by writers and authors. It was an image, a monument known as Women with a Burden. I don't know how many people saw it, the burden called La Caga. It was created by the sculptor Bernardo Botero. And this monument was said to be located in Germany and was erected in 1959. The monument depicts a woman carrying an enormous burden on her back, consisting of various household items, washing machine, buckets, brooms, wash basin, and other household items. And at the feet of that woman, there were 3 children who appeared to be helping her or seeking protection. The monument, for me, drew attention to the issue of gender inequality and the invisible labor women perform, and kind of calls for a rethinking of the division of responsibility in the family and society. It actually, for me, depicts the physical and emotional burden of household work, childbearing, and other social expectations that often rest on women's shoulders. My question to the authors stems from chapter 18 still, where you said the African women from antiquity have been deeply immersed in the functioning of social institutions, and they have exercised both political and economic power in public domains. What changed then? African women carrying more burdens. In a society that is failing with moral decadence now the order of the day, what do we need to do? In a failed society, failure starts from the home, in my own perception. What do you suggest can be done? I think that's what first question I need to ask. And the question is, are African women really carrying this domestic burden? Are they carrying it more? And then on chapter 19 talked about the role of women in peace building. And quite a lot of questions. Yes, women perform change roles. But before I even go to that chapter, still on chapter 18, there were some questions. What actually inspired your focus on women's political participation in Africa? Because yes, some people will argue, yes, women have been doing a lot. Yes, some people said women were not doing a lot. How do you see it evolving in the next decade? What do you think can change? And then how do you assess the impact of political parties' structure on women's candidacy and success? Because for me, I think political party itself has a lot of role to play when it comes to putting women out there, when it comes to political representation. And then can you speak a little more about the role of informal networks and mentorship in supporting women in politics? And the fourth question on that chapter 18 is, what lesson can Nigeria learn or from other African countries with higher female representation, given the fact that they've had a lot of issues on quota that have been introduced? That's on chapter 18. And then for chapter 19, looking at the role of women in peace building and conflict resolution, yes, quite. Yes, women have actually done a lot in peace building networks and from even at the local level, try to ensure that there are peace. But then there's still conflict. What role do women, because women are not just, a lot of people say women are victims, but realize that women are not just victims. Some of them are even collaborators. Some of them are becoming even main actors when it comes to conflicts. They are used, they are not just victims. Because I remember that I wrote that in one of my books. But what do you think can be done? Because when there is conflict, there can be peace and there can be development. What role do you
Dr. Agbalajobi, you are frozen. Hello. Okay. Is there a way to okay, she doesn't know. Mr. Ajad, is there a way to contact Professor Agbalajobi to let her know that her screen is frozen? Okay, I'm sorry she has dropped out, and she will probably get back in, and we will return to her so that she can finish her session. So in the meantime, we'll move to Professor Rathore, and you will give your presentation, and yeah, we'll go from there. Please go ahead.
Thank you so much. You can hear me, right?
Yes, perfectly well.
Yes. So I think as everyone has already said, right, this book does both things. It broadens our understanding of the stories, the histories, the politics of African women, as well as deepens it, right? And for me, my first question to the authors, to be very honest, when I was asked to come on this panel was, I'm not an expert on African feminism or women in Africa. Are you sure you want me on this panel? and I think, and that's why I say I'm so grateful for this opportunity, because for me, it was a moment of learning. Because, and especially with my work on the period of decolonization and feminist history and transnational activism and South-South solidarities, often when I'm writing, I keep thinking to myself that, and that is usually a presupposition, right? Where you're writing a history and you think you're unique, and this is happening to you and your societies for the first time, and these are very unique experiences, and these are unique experiences in their own ways. But at the same time, the way gender transcends across societies, there are also similarities that we draw from, including in historical writing. And one thing which has for long caught my fascination has been the histories of women's transnationalism, where and especially in post-colonial societies, and I'm talking as someone who's writing on India, where we have these narratives of internationalism, but we are perpetually, and that's probably what's inspired my current project also, where I would keep thinking that why is it that we are always conversing with each other through Europe? Why is it that we are always conversing with each other through North America? For me, also the starting point was the the San Francisco conference and the coming together of United Nations. But then when I went back and as someone who's grown up with this history of anti-imperialism in India in textbooks as a school kid, it completely baffled me that how is it that we had so many strong women who were international and who were traveling across global south and who were meeting their counterparts, but I don't read about them. I don't read about them in the international that I'm taught as a scholar of IR, the international that I am taught as a scholar of diplomacy. And as I was going through this book, I kept reading it and thinking about it along with this other work that I'm looking at, which is Chen Quan-Singh's Asia as a Method, as a framework of re-engaging with the history and knowledge of Asia. And that's what, for me, that's what this book, as someone who's working on international history, what it did for me was to reorient my intellectual gaze, right? And what I say, it's definitely not something which is new. But of course, there is the central argument of moving beyond the West and moving beyond this fixation of rewriting our histories beyond our encounters with histories of the global North. And also writing in terms of and this is a conversation when we met earlier also yesterday, and and the initial preparatory conversation we had, and I kept thinking to myself that in this project of decolonizing knowledge, there's also a project of rewriting histories with agency, yes, but also reimagining dignity in the writing of the international. And that comes with and there I have a slight provocation for the authors, because when they write and they say this is the history of the national histories, the local histories and the regional histories, but these are also international histories. Yes. Where emerging from, we are as international from where we are writing. Whether I write from Asia, I am international. Whether you write from Africa, you are international. And that also then enables us and gives us the framework, which I think this book is doing, is to look at our geographies beyond the securitized labels that have been given to us in the period of, in the post-colonial period. So whether it's and the authors do discuss it, that there's North Africa and there's West Africa, which completely different parts of Africa, which really, and there's a lot of projection over here, because these are things I keep thinking about in my own work. But, for example, I keep thinking about South Asia. And whenever I'm writing South Asia, I write S with a small s, because I keep thinking, but we are south of Asia. South Asia is a term which did not come to us naturally. It was a securitized term which came from the, from the global North to us. And then at the same time, the justification of, and again, this is, when the authors are writing about the need to justify, the need to write these histories and write these experiences just because they exist. And I won't lie, when I was reading it, I got a little uncomfortable, because probably in my own understanding, I have become fed up of justifying or why we need to write these histories and why we need to write these experiences. I vehemently try to, other than what the discipline asks me to. I'm just fed up of all of us justifying why what we are writing is important. It is important. I don't want to explain it to you why it is important. I don't want to explain it to you why it is important only because maybe there's a market rationality that now this is an emerging market and now Africa is going to be the next continent with demographic dividends. So let's go and understand the society and let's go and understand the gender. No, it is important beyond the market rationality. And there again, this book makes a great contribution, because more often than not, when we are bringing the peripheries from the global north, as the north sees the peripheries, into the center, we go into these, the first step of that intellectual labor is just excavation, because it has not been written. And and there are generations of scholars who do that excavation. So I think this book, in that way, is providing so much of material to engage with, which would help the next generation of scholars to not and I want to phrase this very carefully, because I don't think we always begin with nothing have been excavated. It's just that it's not in the disciplinary lexicons, which are usually in English. So we think it has not been excavated as yet. Our methodologies do not permit us, from how we are trained in universities. And as we get bolder and as we get more confident, we move beyond that. And also, and probably these are the trajectories where I can, because as I was going through it, I kept thinking to myself, okay, I would want each section to emerge into a compendium of its own, maybe a compendium on intellectual history, a book on transnational history, where we are, and I'm borrowing from Chen Kuan-Seng's framing of critical syncretism, which is basically actively internalizing elements from each other and creating a new shared subjectivity. Because even while we are thinking, and probably because I'm thinking about Asia, and then when I was reading about Africa, but when you go back and you read about the solidarities, there was a sense of geographical belonging, but there was also a sense which went beyond cartographical categories. And that is something which I am really interested to, like, I honestly want to talk to the authors and ask them, what did you find? What else? Like, honestly, what did you leave out while you were writing the book? Because I'm sure this is a fraction of everything that you found and you wanted to write. And more importantly, and I will stop here because I don't want to, I don't want to go beyond my time, but also to think with each other across our subjectivities, as both pre-colonial actors and post-colonial actors, to also engage with our experiences as feminists dealing with the state, because we also have to be careful that we do not build a narrative of transnationalism which does not take into account the might of the state and how state engages with gender. And in that way, because this work is so vast, and because it touches upon every tangent of gendered existence, it enables us also to come together as feminists at this point and in this age where we are dealing with questions of hypermasculinity and militarization and war, more in our face than for some of us before. I also aware, like, just saying this is the right thing to do, that's why you should do it, is not enough, because you have to prove the impact factor of every research that you're doing at this point of time. I think this book also provokes us in that way to think about how how the post-colonial state has also developed, and also the mechanisms of violence and the colonialities of the state, which then got embedded. And then how those subjectivities further developed. And as the authors open with the history as a provocation. So for me, that was the main takeaway from this work. And I will stop here. But honestly, I do want to ask you, what did you leave out? How did you decide that, okay, this is the limit and there's a lot more left? I would be very curious to know that. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Professor Rathore. I'm not going to preempt the authors, but you asked many questions that I had as well while reading the book. Because after all these things, I said, what exactly did they not cover, right? I was going to say they didn't touch religion. Yes, that is one point I was going to take up. Then I saw there was already a chapter. So what was left out? It seems so, comprehensive in its scope, and I look forward to their responses in this respect. Professor Agbalajobi, you're welcome back. I'm sorry, you're muted. I'm sorry how you dropped out, and yes, we missed the rest of your statement, and so I'll give you some time to complete your presentation, and then we'll go on from there. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. I didn't know. I'm sorry, network. I was trying to. So I was talking about the chapter 19 about the role of women, and that women are not just victims. That women are also agents of change, and women have served. The chapter talked about women have served as mediators, community mobilizers, and caregivers during war conflict, and their grassroots involvement provides critical insight into local dynamics, and we have examples across the globe. But my question, and I just wanted to say that the other thing I felt was important, given my recent interaction with the political settlement framework, how important it is to look at like what my panelist just spoke said, the role of the state, because it's important, the political will of leaders and all stakeholders in this issue of the role of women when it comes to peace building. And I think it's very, very important to look at this because the political settlement framework gives us an understanding of the different stakeholders and their role, and how important it is that not just one person can actually engender the kind of change we want. And how do you see the role of education and economic empowerment in strengthening women's capacity to lead in conflict resolution? Is one question I want to end with here, because for me, I think it's important. Education, for me, cuts across. And I think, although we kind of see some pocket of change when it comes to developed areas, but at that context, conflict and fragile setting, a lot of young girls are still being deprived of education. And so what do you think can change? How do we resolve these challenges? Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Agbalajobi. Thank you for not giving up. If it helps your feed, if it helps your reception, you can take down the video. If anything happens, it helps sometimes to take down the video, and then it improves the reception. Okay, thank you. Professor Ojo, you're up now. You're muted, please.
Thank you. Can you hear me now?
Perfectly well.
Thank you so much. And thank you, colleagues, for the wide constructive feedback that you've already given. Please, you will just indulge me because I'm expected to address 4 chapters quickly, and given the space on which I'm working. As we've said earlier, this book is not just a compilation of chapters, it's a bold discourse that enriches our body of knowledge by interrogating history, power, gender, and agency from African women's perspective. And, these advances conversation that we urgently need, especially as we reflect on Africa's development in the 21st century. So I'm starting with chapter 9, which reflect on African women's economic activities. And while I was going through that, this reminds us that women have always been at the forefront of Africa's economic survival, whether in agriculture, in trade, in informal markets, or entrepreneurship. But yet, as we well know, their contributions are often undervalued and underdocumented. So this chapter is actually significant because it not only recovers these narratives, but also challenges us to rethink, right, the policy frameworks that marginalize women's economic agency. From the recent work I've done, I was giving a keynote speech with the UN framework in South Africa here, and we were talking about the economic inequality and unemployment, right? And especially within the Black and rural women, right? And how, we have higher unemployment, and in which the labor force participation rate for women is actually 15% lower than that of men. And, also the nuances on women-owned enterprises struggle to access credit markets and procurement opportunities. And with just 10% of land owned by women, right, which is limiting them from financial inclusion gaps, which persists prominently in the rural and the informal sector. So we can say that, African women play a pivotal role, right, both in the formal and the informal economics, just as we know, and they still face this significance barrier, which has been an ongoing discourse. I love what Prof. Rathore was saying, that I don't need to explain to you why this is important, because sometimes when we come, these families have started, right? But these are important discourses that we really need to address. So going back to the book, right, on page 204, I love that quote that says the long relegation of women to domestic duties and notion of men being the sole breadwinner is gradually weighing off in Africa, which we all know, and multiple women have joined the formal and the economic sector, right? Nevertheless, women continue to be the predominant, employees in the informal economic sector. And that very quotation notion that says, to maintain the dominating structures of gender-based employment and patriarchal marriage ideals, it is not uncommon for women to quit their job to be with their husband and family, or because she earns more than the husband, right? Hence, most women are pushed into the informal economic sector by these circumstances and are usually self-employed. So that was something that really resonated with me. And I just posed that question, which I'm posing to the authors now, that can we narrate this, right? And say that, is this still applicable to the current society? And is this, prominent factors which you have highlighted, the reason why we have more women within the informal sector as compared to the formal sector, right? And secondly, can we really say that women are victims or they are perpetrators of themselves, of their own mindset and belief system, right? Are they victims of their own mindset beliefs or the existing patriarchal norms and culture of the society in which they belong to? So that will be something that I would really like to hear from both of you regarding that. Because like we well know even from the book, 92.3% of women are working in the informal sector, and just 1/3 of these women are in the formal sector in Africa. So can we just say that these are the reasons why we're having this high scale of gender inequality within that spectrum, right? And I really love the way they wrap that chapter, giving examples, of the non-domestic economic activities within the informal sector and the formal sector, and the issue of petty trading, domestic care work, and so on and so forth, which you find more women, and the subsistence agric farming, which you find the women in the informal sector centering most. And, you know, looking at the policy implication of that in terms of the financial and the political literacy, you know, as we witness the subtle decline of women in leadership roles, right? So it's paramount to say that it is important. So I'm resonating. I think that all of us are really looking into that, you know, as the authors have stated in page 215, that international agencies and government, you know, should be well aware of this and ensure that they continue to contribute their own quota to women economic empowerment, because this is actually the achievement towards the SDG. So, you know, to round up this chapter, you know, I would just say that as Africa undergoes rapid shift in digitalization, in green economies, in cross-trade border barriers, what will you say are the innovative strategies or interventions, you know, that can ensure that Africa women's economic activities are not just sustained? Let me slow down there. Like, what are the innovative strategies and interventions that can ensure that African women's economic activities are not just sustained, but transformed into engines of empowerment and generational wealth? I hope the authors are able to get that. Then coming to chapter 10 quickly, on African women in science and technology, I've done a lot of vast work here, lot of scholarship here and books, and this actually opens up a critical frontier. We all know that after the COVID, it was a main rhetoric for the need for women to be digitally included, right? So in a world that is driven by innovation and digital transformation, this chapter actually demonstrates, you know, both the historical exclusion women have faced in STEM fields and the contemporary stride being made by African women scientists and technologists, right? And its importance actually lies in showing us that sustainable development in Africa must include deliberate investment in women's scientific knowledge and technological creativity. There is a huge wide digital divide, which is still going on, although we're having, you know, a lot of increase step by step, especially within the middle-aged women, from the research I've done, from 30 years to 65, 70, who suddenly found themselves in a digitalized economy, which they could not resonate with. And those who could not get help in a formalized institution were actually excluded totally. And they are still excluded, right? So this is very paramount, especially in the marginalized spaces. And only 37% of women in low-income areas still have access today to smartphones or digital services. So women in Africa, you know, needs, although there's a lot of increase now of them entering science and technological fields, and with 47% of STEM graduates in African universities, but there is still more. So what resonates with me in this chapter? I love the fresh perspective of that icon in which they stated that women are important creators and contributors to indigenous technology and innovation in historical times and today. It was a beautiful study to learn about how women have actually emerged, right, from indigenous technology and innovation from the past, from history till where we are today, right? But the truth is they still remain custodians. Despite being custodians of knowledge, they are still left behind in the rural areas to carry, you know, these indigenous innovations which they carry. So that aspect, right, in which Ese-osa was saying that across Africa, women are known, for instance, to play key roles, right, in production, in processing and marketing of food, was quite reflection, you know, looking at the interpretation of STEM language and how African women have been important creators and conveyors of this knowledge in terms of biology in itself, anatomy, right, zoology, botany, veterinary medicine, agriculture, food science, biodiversity, environmental science, climate science, pharmacy, like it just goes on and on. And the highlights that was showing 86% of Tonkerere women in Southwest Nigeria, possessing and engaging in pharmaceutical knowledge and practices amongst themselves, using medicinal plants, right, to treat various illnesses. It was quite amazing to get that data. Women in Burkina Faso being able to identify, to collect, to process different parts of the baobab tree, for food, for medicine. The Malian women also extracting oil from the caucus plants, and most especially in Limpopo region of South Africa, where women are the predominant subsistence farmers, right? And they are able to deploy knowledge on rain forecasting, right? Looking at the soil types without going to formalized school, institution, and fertilization, being able to do mulching, storage, and all those things, and through the agricultural practice is so beautiful and unique. I would have really loved to see more of this in this book. I want to believe this is the first volume of this book, because there's a lot more that this book can really offer, right? And because it's quite a tragedy that the continent today does not recognize, doesn't encourage, doesn't develop or invest in these women-led knowledges and innovations, which is already in existence. So this is something that I would really love the authors to flesh out more, right? And kindly respond, to this. And
Professor Ojo, I might have to stop you. You have so much to say, and we will let the authors, they will have to respond. And so, yes, we need them to be able to catch their breath. You have made a lot of important points that I'm sure they will take up. And when you said, Dr., you said that this is probably the first installment in a book series, my first thought is don't tempt Dr. Falola. Before you know it, you will do a dozen books on all these subjects that you said you should cover. You will do a dozen books on it. So, yes. Thank you very much, Professor Ojo.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yes. Professor Owusu, you are up now.
Thank you. So I'll start straight up with a question to the authors. How did you balance academic rigor and accessibility for a wide readership? That is an area in which I think a lot of academic authors struggle with, myself included. That said, I want to go off tangent and talk about myself. So I want to start with my book, which Cosmopolitan Nationalism in Ghana. It came out last year, 2024, with Cambridge. Now, in that book, I examined how Ghanaian political thinkers, mostly men, negotiated nation building within a broader global landscape. In fact, I congratulated myself because I did the transnational thing and I saw so many connections. But as I researched that work and as I found a question that suddenly, right, which was, where are the women? Because I kept writing about men as thinkers. And I found women. So I realized also the better question is not so much where are the women as why are there no women in African intellectual history? Why are women not dominant there? Why aren't they on that same footing? And as I reflected on it, I saw that, yes, my work challenged the idea that nationalism was a purely local project. It challenged many assumptions about nationalist language, in terms of scholarship. But to self-reflect and include women, I saw that it meant changes in methodology and the sources that are used. And so some of the things I have about 8 women that I'm thinking of and writing about now. I'll take just one of them. I'll expand on her work as I speak. So when I thought of these women and the work they had done, majority of them are what we would call pioneers in their fields. One of them recently died. In Ghana, where our life expectancy is below 60, this woman's age alone, she died at the age of 101. So her age alone is an achievement, And she's part of a group that attended Achimota. Achimota is one of the colonial education establishments in Ghana. And they are called Achimota 4, Achimota 5, depending on who's thinking through them. This woman is a pioneer in terms of her name. Her name is Ese-osa. She's a pioneer in terms of the area of pharmacy, pioneer pharmacist in Ghana. And thinking through her life and her work, I realized that she's better known as an interesting figure, pioneer pharmacist, but her life work includes setting up one of Ghana's most successful ventures, which is rural banking. So the Manya Korbo Rural Bank was established through her work. And this has nothing to do with her background as a pharmacist, right? It's one of her most biggest achievements because the Manya Korbo Rural Bank is part of Ghana's Club 100. And it's not just her, there are other women. So thinking through why are the women missing, I realized that, the women are missing because we are looking, when we do intellectual history, we are text-centric. We pick texts, we pick books. And so a lot of these women, they wrote, but they did not write great books. That's why I missed them. That's why many people also miss them. But does that make their contributions less? Another thing about myself I want to say is the work I did with smart cities. I worked as the head of a smart cities unit located in the Ministry of Finance and in that work of Ghana. And in that work, I worked with the International Telecommunications Union and I became the head of the United for Smart Sustainable Cities Hub, U4SSC Hub in Ghana for ITU. That meant that I had to think about sustainable development and things like that. We did that a lot. In that work too, in fact, that work is what made me think differently about another of the Achimota 5, Letitia Obeng. Before then, I was interested in the colonial education that these women went through. So Letitia Obeng is also Ghana's pioneer scientist. And that was what she meant to me. I was fascinated. I interviewed her in about 2010. I was fascinated with how she was fascinated with parasites. Her eyes would light up. She's such a big person. Parasites. Parasites are so, she spoke with such passion about parasites and what she learned about parasites. She studied the black fly that causes onchocerciasis. And in her work, Obeng does more than science. She becomes a public intellectual. She becomes one person who links Ghana's establishment of the Akosombo Dam to date. Ghana's Akosombo Dam that gives us 80% of our electricity is the biggest, is the largest in the world, man-made. And Obein's work centered dams, construction of dams. She asked a pertinent question: should dams be built? And as I worked with ITU, I had a light bulb moment where I saw that she was actually talking about, she had sustainable development thinking. The entire body of her work encapsulates sustainable development thinking that is not credited to any African, right? And she writes in the 70s, 60s, 80s. She studies the black fly. She works with the local people. She thinks about their economic livelihood and develops a body of work that centers sustainable development, that yes, dams should be built, but we must center the lives of the people who are directly impacted immediately. So working with her work, looking at her work, I also realized that even those who write about onchocerciasis rarely mention her. And then for those who talk about the dam, recently books have been written, films have been made, she's not mentioned. So the silence on women's work makes me want to ask the authors, in your view, what are some of the most overlooked contributions of African women to science, technology, or intellectual traditions? Now, these women I'm working with now, majority of them, as I said, navigated colonial education. And so that makes me want to ask the authors again, how did women who experience colonial education navigate the system? So in the end, for me, there is another question which I want to align with Dr. Rathore, who spoke before me. Thinking through the violence and coloniality of the post-colonial state. For me, when I think of gender-based violence in the national history of Ghana, where my work is located and where I come from, I also see the silence in your book on how the coercive powers of the state was brought down on women during military rule. In Ghana, gender-based violence, yes, we can talk about the personal, but the coercive powers of the state during military rule that dehumanized women, took away their humanity in many ways, in which nowadays I've told myself that I am centering a history of hope. The histories that I write are going to look forward at hope. And so I do not want to belabor this point about the state and its violence and what it did to women. But I still want to ask how you place this and why, in talking about gender-based violence, you chose not to explore this. Thank you very much. I'll allow others to speak.
Thank you very much, Professor Owusu. You have given us so much to think about, and I'm sure the authors are taking notes because these are the kind of questions they would love to respond to. I am very inspired about the Achimota 5 you talked about, and I'm sure going to be reading more about them. And like Professor Rathore said, we should not have to justify why we do what we do, but this, again, is justification writ large. This is why we should study women. This is why this book is very important. This is why we should build this foundation so that the labor of women is not obscured by structures that make it look like women are not generally not suited for, these areas of studies, these areas of knowledge. And it's really fascinating, the questions you brought up. Thank you very much. Professor Idahosa, now you are up. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Yakob Haliso and Professor Falola, once again for the invitation to be part of the panel. And thank you to the panelists for your excellent contributions and thought-provoking questions so far. Given the limited time, I would, as I said earlier, offer an engagement with 4 chapters that kind of intersect with my work. I'll first kind of summarize the chapters, connecting them to my work, and then kind of reflect on 4 or 5 questions for the authors. So these chapters on colonialism, apartheid, education, and racism, my engagement really focused on these in relation to education. They masterfully show how colonial systems created interlocking structures of oppression, structures that I have and continue to explore in my own work, and structures that continue to manifest and be felt in the neoliberal university today, not just in policies, but also in the pattern of interactions between students and staff, between also staff, between leaders, staff, and students, structures that kind of create profound barriers for Black women, for African women. But importantly, the chapters and the book itself reveal a constant kind of unbroken chain of resistance and agency. So the book is not necessarily a tale of the history of victimization of women, but also of the ways in which women resisted and the way they deployed their agency. Chapter 2, in particular, on colonialism, argues that colonialism was not a mere interlude, but one of lasting consequence that continues, like I said, to be felt today, and that fundamentally re-engineered gendered relations on the continent, where colonial authorities use strategies of economic disenfranchisement, political exclusion, as the authors note, through indirect rule, and a deliberately gendered education system that confined women to domesticity. These blueprints, or the authors argue, persists today, such that education in Africa still reproduces this trope, these Eurocentric norms that sideline indigenous or traditional knowledges, that sidelines women's epistemologies. These are not new arguments. The colonial scholars, feminist scholars have continued to push against this. So the colonial construction of the European male as the political, as the economic, and the somatic norm continues to haunt African institutions today that produce women as othered, that exclude them, that marginalize them. And we see this play out in the representation, particularly in leadership, whether it's in politics or in education, where men continue to dominate the upper echelons of these spaces. Now, say compared to 50 years ago, we see better representation, but the underlying structural and cultural oppression still persists today. And we see the chapter on apartheid in particular consolidates how these Eurocentric norms and these colonial logics reach their most brutal and formalized expression, where Black women under apartheid face the triple jeopardy, as the authors argue, of race, class, gender, and I'll also add sexual forms of oppression. Colonial laws disrupted family structures. They turned women into an exploited labor force. Yet the authors showed that women resisted powerfully, from the Bantu Women's League to the iconic 1956 Women's March in Pretoria. And several of my research and my research projects have engaged this topic of the constraints and the resistance to within post-apartheid institutions and post-apartheid universities, where women often narrate the experience of being situated outside in the university, but inside the institution, yet excluded from centers of power. What this book documents in the apartheid era, I trace in higher education today: the constant negotiation of credibility, of legitimacy, of belonging, particularly in historically masculinized spaces, or what post-colonial and feminist scholars have argued as negotiating legitimacy in spaces that was not originally designed for Black people or for women. And finally, the chapter 8, the chapter on African women and education, shows how the colonial gendered gap continues to shape access, where poverty, structural norms, and early pregnancy remain significant barriers in accessing education. And in my work, I've argued that this shows that representation alone is not sufficient. It's not sufficient doesn't mean that providing access doesn't mean that all women or all Black people will be able to negotiate or feel like they belong within the institution in the same way as their male counterparts. So too often, women are included symbolically while structurally, culturally excluded. And these structural forms of inequality, cultural forms of inequality, stereotypes, and gender norms remained unaddressed by institutional policies. And even where they are addressed, for example, in South African context, we see in the post-apartheid era, direct policy involvement and intention to kind of reverse and undo the impact of apartheid legacy. Yet we still see that questions of belonging, resistance to agency still feature in the narratives of women within these spaces. What this shows is that any kind of genuine transformation needs to acknowledge the ways in which structural and cultural inequality impacts access and belonging. Beyond that, it shows how creating leadership pathways where women shape institutional agendas is important. I would skip the chapter on STEM because I think two of our panelists have talked about that. But I want to just note something about the body there because this kind of ties in my work on STEM and women and first generation women in academia. My work on body politics show that women exclusion is not just about structural exclusion, but it's also corporeal. We see that even when women enact and exercise their agency, we see body forms of exclusions and resistance to their efforts at transformation. Where in higher education institutions, women bodies continues to be marked as strange, they're treated as trespassers in male-dominated fields. This has impact on who has the authority to speak, who feels legitimate enough to stand and push for transformation strategies. I think what I really appreciate going through these chapters and the book is that it doesn't, like I said earlier, tell a story of passive victimization, but of active agency, of the ways in which women have resisted and pushed back. To avoid spending too much time, this engagement and rich analysis leaves me with a few questions for the authors, which I hope can spark further discussion. The first is on methodology. Given the book's vast and continent-wide scope, how did you navigate the tension between presenting a coherent Pan-African narrative of these structural forces while still honoring the profound diversity and heterogeneity of women's experiences across the different contexts? The second is on really contemporary activism. The book really masterfully shows and details historical forms of resistance, like the, I think it's 1929 Women's War. How do you view the rise of digital activism today, such as the EndSARS protest in Nigeria? Either as a continuation of these historical modes of organizing or as a fundamental departure from them? How do you kind of engage these new forms of activism? In the chapter on apartheid, there was a lot of emphasis on collective protests and a lot of emphasis always on collective protests and collective agency. I wonder, what about the quieter forms of resistance and the ways in which women have pushed back? And this is not new. Historically, women have found subtle ways of pushing back. I would leave maybe I have one other question on the future, well, I think, or future interventions, but I will leave that and ask the question on embodiment. This STEM chapter in particular talks about barriers, but there is less focus on embodiment. And I was wondering, given that we know that under apartheid, under colonialism, some of these violence were inflicted on the body. I wonder how we might theorize the body as central to women's experience, the exclusion and the experience of exclusion, their resistance and their agency. I will leave it there.
Oh, thank you very much, Professor Idahosa. You have asked 4 comprehensive questions, and yes, I'm looking forward to hearing the answers. Thank you so much. And finally, Professor Christine Vogt-William, we come to you, and you're up now.
Yes, thank you so much. It's been very inspiring listening to the previous speakers. I have a few quotes from the book itself as tasters, from the 4 chapters that I chose to focus on. I don't know who exactly is managing the slides. Is it possible to go to the large screen viewing and then get to the first slide, perhaps? Yes. Yeah, so what follows is going to be basically a whole set of thought impulses. Yeah, I am a believer in the unfinished conversation. I undertook several conversations with this book, and it's been a joy as well as a challenge. But here goes, right? The first chapter that I chose to focus on is chapter 5, African Feminisms and Women's Movements Through History. This chapter caught my attention due to the unequivocal political stance that is articulated. African feminism challenges the subservient, derogatory, and marginalized status of African women, opposing attitudes that were prevalent in those patriarchal African societies where women had been seen as property. And I'll stop there for now. In light of this stance, I would want to bring in the aspect of African values and the question of agency of African women as citizens of the continent. The question of values is an aspect brought up often in my conversations with African scholars, both men and women scholars. And of course, there are often very different ideas of how African values are constituted. As a woman of color scholar living in a diasporic context in a global north space like Germany, I'm struck and comforted by the material that I found in this book, seeing that political stances are just as important in the shaping of epistemic engagements in the complex purview of African studies. Operating from a German position and working with Afro-German, African, and Black German feminist scholars and activists, I recognize how politicized the institutional space of the German higher education is. Working in that context, the political positions that influence knowledge production, agendas, and endeavors are not to be ignored. The historicity of African women's moves towards emancipation is more than apparent. Indeed, there is a large tradition of African feminism that serves as a valuable resource pool of epistemic frames and African values that should be recognized as part of the African knowledge archive. It is my work here in the cluster to promote this recognition and active integration of this body of knowledge in research and teaching practices for men and women scholars who choose to engage with African life worlds and contexts. This is an ongoing conversation in the purview of my job. The decolonial agenda that is evident in African women's activism, academic engagements, and artistic endeavors drive forward the necessity of interrogating the coloniality of power evident in knowledge production, the coloniality of race and the coloniality of gender, concepts that have been cogently articulated by decolonial scholars like Anibal Quijano from 2000 and Maria Lugones in her essays from 2008 and 2010, and who, although not African scholars from the continent, have mobilized the thought impulses that have been furnished by decolonial scholars like Ngugi wa Thiong'o in his Decolonizing the Mind of 1986, Oyeronke Oyevumi from 1997 in her Invention of Women, from Ifi Amadume from her 1987 work, Female Husbands and Male Daughters. And of course, the Codesria editing collective Aisha Imam, Fatou Sow, and Amina Mama, who produced the groundbreaking volume Engendering African Social Sciences in 1997. And these are just a few of those works. Indeed, Maria Lugones expressly cites Oyeronke Oyevuvumi's 1997 invention of women in her 2008 essay, Coloniality of Gender, alongside the indigenous North American feminist scholars. Lugones' coloniality of gender is clearly part of the conversation in Women in Africa when one considers that African feminism attempts to decolonize the continent and break Europe's stranglehold on its economy, history, and knowledge. It aims to refocus African history, people, and needs by bringing their experiences into the discourse of gender equality and women's empowerment. As an epistemology, it aims to subvert patriarchy and all oppressive structures by understanding the colonialism, racism, gender, and class discrimination that impact the agency of women. While going through the book, I kept in mind a couple of African values in mind, which I had the opportunity of identifying during a critical diversity literacy workshop last November in a collaboration between the Africa Multiple Cluster and the WITS Center for Critical Diversity at the University of Witwatersrand. These values included the principle of Utu Ubuntu, succinctly stated in I am because you are, the respect for and integration of the ancestors and elders in community life and decision-making, the principle of hospitality towards anyone who comes to the community, sharing resources, and especially amongst women, the responsibility of mothering. The quote above maps out some of these ideas, which I think would be germane to our discussion today, especially given the extent of how patriarchy itself delivers frames of reference, policy, and action that frequently erases African women's knowledges and African feminist epistemologies, which are necessary to consider how African citizenship can be envisioned. And I think several of our colleagues here today have pressed upon that point. And again, without wanting to continue in the frame of justification, I would insist on that point. Next slide, please. This chapter, chapter 11, Racism, Gender, and African Women, was quite clear in its complex conception of how the colonialities of race and gender are still intersectionally active in shaping African women's lives, both on the continent and in the African diasporas. Starting off with the observation, the intersection of race and gender is fundamental to the African woman's experience, as her experiences within the continent and diaspora are subject to complex and intersecting systems of subjugation. I was intrigued to read how race and gender were entangled in shaping the lives of African women, especially on the continent. Entanglements which manifested in ideologies of colorism influencing body-shaping projects like skin lightening, which mobilized specific beauty ideals aligned with intricate and insidious operations of race consciousness that have been internalized, all of which were captured in the succinct observation. The notion of white supremacy communicated by white dominance instills an unconscious self-denigration and white aspiration in Africans. This, of course, bears definitely another deeper engagement and a deeper conversation, especially if we were to try to incorporate certain principles from critical whiteness studies in that conversation. The practice of skin lightening is not the only body shaping project undertaken. Another common practice would be that of hair straightening, also in keeping with certain perceptions of Western beauty ideals. These practices notably are parts of economies of desire and monetary economies associated with beauty industries which cater to these aspirations of whiteness. The chapter is clear in its critical stance of locating the modes of intersectional power operating to discipline African women's bodies, informing their choices in presenting themselves in socio-economic relational interactions, for example, social and romantic relationships, as well as relations in the workspaces, which tend to privilege lighter-skinned women. You can find this on page 240. Structural and cultural operations of power, as set out by Patricia Hill Collins and Sirma Bilge in their 2018 volume of Intersectionality, come together here, showing the intersections of how racialized and gendered perceptions also mobilize class readings of darker-skinned women's bodies, leading to their marginalization, especially in West African and South African contexts. My question here to the authors is, Will there be a second volume that perhaps addresses these exact types of skin politics which mobilize internalized colonialities of race in East African as well as North African context, especially when we consider interesting sort of intersections with religious discourse. Some of this has already been addressed, I believe, in the sexuality chapter, where Christianity and Islamic belief systems have basically also been addressed in those intersections. So similar power dynamics are seen to be at work in diasporic contexts of African American women, as well as more recent African women migrants to the United States. So once again, I would want to ask how this then sits within the framework of African values and African citizenship agency. As someone positioned outside recognizable African contexts, I have consistently been told by a number of African knowledge producers situated in African universities that the question of race is not relevant in African continental contexts, but rather that of ethnicity. While the question of gender is also not that relevant to some people in some cases, since many are convinced of the complementarity of gender, which was explained to me in the frame of a specific understanding of African women and men having specific gendered responsibilities which are aligned with African values. My question here then would be, how does one then account for the types of racial and gender disparities rendered visible in the studies cited in this book? I submit that conversations are necessary between African perceptions of gender and racialized being and those of the diasporic context, since the work set out in this book demonstrates that these are unfinished conversations that still need to be taken up, especially in the current global political climate, where race and gender and the colonialities surrounding these identity vectors are still making themselves felt in very complex and often virulent ways. As regards how these matters are being addressed in continental and diasporic higher education contexts, I see the necessity of more nuanced curiosity and engagement with these particular aspects in African studies research agendas and how institutional research cultures are developed and optimized. Hence, the observation, racial prejudice is perpetuated by institutions and persons in various socio-economic, political, religious, cultural capacities, requires some extensive discussion in Global North and Global South higher education institutions. Next slide, please.
Professor Vogt-William, I might have to stop you here. I have been following you. I appreciate it, but we need to move to the next stage now. So let's, when we give the audience a chance to ask questions, then they can take you up on some of these issues. Is that okay?
That's fine.
Thank you very much. I really appreciate that. And thank you for bringing up several aspects up to the screen. Some of the aspects that you showed here were parts that I underlined. And so that it also resonated with you, makes me feel like, yes, we are thinking along the same line. Thank you very much. Okay, so this is the part where we pivot to audience responses, audience Q&A. And the authors have indicated that they will be very willing to answer all the questions at the end of the session, right? So rather than for them to answer now and then we go to the audience, then we start to give the audience a chance to ask questions from now on. And so if you are part of our audience, you want to ask questions, this is your chance now. And I'm going to start to call people one after the other. And while we are at that, please let me enjoin everyone who wants to ask questions to please keep our questions as brief as possible. No extended explanations, no, contextualization, short and succinct. And I also enjoin you not to repeat questions. If somebody has asked a question, please don't have to ask the same question. Just go ahead and, ask a different question. And while we are waiting for audience members to prepare their question, I will take the moderator's privilege to also ask the question from our authors, because in listening to all the panelists, I have, I found a pattern to their analysis, and I want to put them into a question that also resonates with me and what I thought reading the book. And so several times while I'm going through this book, I think this is so interesting. This is so informative. But I look out of the window, there's a window right here in front of me, and I look onto the window of reality, and it sometimes doesn't feel like women have made as much progress as it looks like, right? It feels sometimes that there are too many forces that hold back women. And I will ask this question. Why does it feel that way? And I'm using the word feel deliberately, right? In many areas, there are, women have done considerably well. But when you look at some contemporary reality, it doesn't look like that. And Nigeria has given us one illustrative example that you are free to speak to, which is in the subject of legislation, right? We've followed the issue in the Nigerian National Assembly, where a female lawmaker, one of the 3 out of 108, alleged sexual harassment. And the person she accused was the Senate president. He was never questioned, he was never probed, he just denied it. And then the woman was suspended for being unruly. And she went to court to challenge this unconstitutional move. And then they used the judgment against her. So we're looking at a democracy that is supposed to be the place where justice is supposed to be advanced. And now it's been used to put justice in suspension. And so when we look at different examples like this, right, and all the, the protection of the male, the patriarchy against a woman who has claimed an offense, you sometimes be tempted to say, why doesn't it feel like we've really progressed, right? We've made so much progress, but again, this is also doesn't look like progress anymore. Now, the second part of the question is also I'm bringing this up from page 123, which is interesting that Professor Vogt-William also highlighted it, talking about feminism and how some women repudiate the label, but they maintain the core principles of feminism. And from my own perch, I'm also seeing some women also imagine that they are not just repudiating the label alone, but they are even pushing back against the core feminist principles, right? And they're opting for conservatism, for traditionalism. And then you see this in the idea of soft life and proud woman and all these ideas. And they look like they are just trends, but they might be also pointing to some ideas. Again, it goes back to the question I asked earlier. Why doesn't it feel like progress? Why doesn't progress feel like progress? So thank you very much. As we do that, now we start to call our audience member. I will start with Simon Mary Kai. I'm sorry if I mispronounce your name. When you come online, please do pronounce your name correctly for the audience. Thank you. Please go ahead with your question.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me?
Perfectly well.
Yeah. I am Simon Mary. I'm a professor of religious studies and theology at University of Portland in the United States. I have 2 questions, though. First, I was this with to Dr. Idahosa. I'm a lead editor of 3-volume works on first-generation college students' realities, but we didn't categorically limit it to female first-gen students. So I'm quite curious to know what the findings are in your research about female first-gen, just out of curiosity of mine. Now, the other question I would like to ask, though I have not read the book, so I'm going to order the book. So if it's covered there, apologies for my ignorance. But it's just because I noticed that some of you were about to touch it, but you would not touch it, especially Professor Idahosa and Professor Vogt-William. The colonial agenda was also a coloniality of imagination, in the sense that it reimagined what it meant to be a woman in Africa. So it wasn't just that the colonial agents came to Africa and they wanted to colonize and exploit. It had an anthropological agenda. So it brought in a European vision of feminism, of womanhood, into the African space. So there was a gender displacement of a meaning of what it meant to be a woman in an African psyche. So that issue has not yet been addressed. And I'm bringing this up because most of you are in the domain of decolonial studies. So it's not just that, oh, women are not present in Africa, or they don't have leadership role, or even if they have leadership roles, they are already traumatized. There's a lot of toxicities that go behind it. It's because any woman that is in Africa is truly not really meant to be woman. So I think what all of you have done, I don't know if the authors of the book did it, and I don't know if you do it also. Do you consider a project of reimagining and engaging that question, what does it mean to be a woman in post-colonial Africa? That head-on engages the coloniality of imagination as it pertains to gender definition.
Thank you very much, Professor Hayokai, and I'm glad that you directed it at our panelists. And I will ask other members of the audience, if you have questions, you can direct it at the author, and you can also direct your questions at the panelists. So they will be ready to take the questions and to respond to you. Now, I will take question from Emeka Nwadiora, JD, PhD, DSW. Please go ahead, sir.
Thank you very much. I appreciate the panelists and the occasion to ask this question. My question has to do with the issue of feminism. Is there a unique definition of feminism from an African point of view? And what is the future of feminism in Africa? Thank you.
Thank you very much. That was a very succinct question. Do we have other hands raised up? Okay, in the meantime, can Professor Jacob Haliso start to respond to some of the questions?
Hello, everyone. I hope you can hear me.
Very well.
All right, thank you. I would have liked to speak almost at the end because we still have one or two hands up of people who would like to comment, because I have written the beginnings of another dissertation while taking the notes from the contributions of these esteemed, distinguished experts on the subject of women, feminism, writ large. The discussion we've had this afternoon, it's as if we just took the concept of women in Africa as an idea that allowed us to interrogate various aspects of reality, of the academia, of intellectual production, and basically of the advancement of society and politics and so on. I would thank our esteemed panelists, Dr. Idahosa, Dr. Rathore, Dr. Ojo, Dr. Vogt-William, Dr. Owusu, Dr. Agbalajobi, for these very brilliant contributions. Thank you for reading the book. Someone reviewed one of my previous books once for a leading journal, and it was very obvious to me that the person did not read the book, because the person only read the preface and the index. And probably you stumble on this review one day. It was just obvious that that was all that the person read. And it doesn't matter what the comments are. It is that the person did not bother to engage. And I think it's intellectual dishonesty to comment on a work that you did not bother to really engage with. So I appreciate what we've done, really drilling down into the issues that this book has raised. It's impossible for me to respond to everything we've raised. Let me begin by how long did it take to write the book? As you can imagine, many years. And the signals of that, of course, are that by the time COVID was over, we had to write COVID into the manuscripts again at the appropriate points because it wasn't there originally. Another indicator of how long it took is that we had completely completed the chapter on, I think it's social media, and it was Twitter, it was Facebook, and by the time we came around to submit the final manuscript, we basically had to rewrite because Facebook was no more a big thing on some of the issues we're talking about. There was no more Twitter. That's just to say that this project has been a journey, and here we are. Dr. Yes, Dr. Adelakun, our very competent moderator. Thank you too. You you took on this assignment literally just a few weeks ago and delved into the book. So I'm going to take all the comments together. I don't think I'll be able to mention these questions one by one. I want to speak first to the issues related to knowledge production about women in Africa and knowledge production about women more broadly. I think Dr. Owusu put it very succinctly with the examples from her own work, how this is such a persistent challenge for those of us that engage with women's lives from different perspectives, that the question of that Dr. Rathore posed, why justify what we do? I would love to stop justifying, but the reality actually is that there is a persistent marginalization of the meanings of what women do in public and in private, and the importance of women's lives, their bodies, their experiences, and the impact of these on society broadly. Even people who engage with women's lives engage with the experiences of women simply as just something you're adding to make sure that the gender scholars in the room do not crucify you, right? So there are these trends that require us to remain on the defensive, which is not the best position to be. And I completely agree on that. That requires us to remain on the defensive because there are some people who are always on the offensive, right? I was just this morning reading a PhD dissertation that I'll be examining in 2 days' time, just reading some parts of it. And I was struck by how a whole section of the literature review about women in Nigeria was entirely about European women's production of knowledge about these Nigerian women. And I was like, this doesn't make sense to me because there is more than enough work to draw on. Of course, I think the person quoted just Ife Amadiome. And I think also there's a problem with just recycling the same names that are out there, which again tells me that people are not really digging deep to find these works and to take them seriously. They are just like, I've heard of Ife Amadiome since graduate school or since my undergraduate days. Let me make sure the name is there. So these are the trends that in our producing this book also provoked us to try to put together this volume. And if you look at the bibliography for the volume, there are so many unknown names, there are so many unknown works, there are works that you would consider gray literature that we took seriously because we just felt that if you stick to, how did Dr. Owusu put it, the women who produced great books, that ultimately we will end up reproducing the views of the West about African women, and we didn't want to do that. So our work resonates very strongly with many of the issues you all have raised in relation to how do we make sense of African women's lives. What did we leave out? That's a question I also like to ask people when I read their books. So I think it's worth saying that we are very cognizant of the gaps in this volume. Our publishers had an optimal number of chapters that could be produced. This is one in a series of textbooks. There are other scholars also working on some other subjects in this series right now, but here we are. And so the way we managed or tried to consolidate ideas was, as in, for example, the chapter on women, agency, and social media, to there talk about more than just social media, but also social justice, protests, young people, and sort of treat these subjects as interrelated, right? And so instead of treating them as singular aspects of reality. Well, again, I acknowledge the silences of the book, I acknowledge the gaps, and someone asks, when is the revision or the second edition coming out? A colleague of mine asked 2 days ago, now that this book is out, what are you thinking about? And I took almost 15 seconds to respond. I said, that's because this book we're talking about, I'm still breathing from, from producing it, right? So we leave the work to everyone else. I don't think there's anybody that can even make a dent in the work that needs to be done. I am excited by a lot of the new work I'm seeing. Some of my graduate students on this call who are researching really interesting, innovative things. I think Dr. Idahosa mentioned NSAS. Did I get that right, or someone else? And how that did not come through directly or with its own theme or spotlight, but which we sort of acknowledged as the long line of feminist activism from colonialism till date. So people are working on these issues. I think, let me also use this as a plug for another project that many of you worked with us on. There's a bigger project than this one, 130 chapters, the Palgrave Handbook of African Women's Studies, which brought together, I don't want to use feminist scholars, let's just say women studies scholars from all around the world who wrote about the state of the art of knowledge on those 130 different themes and subjects. And so that is an academic deep dive, whereas the book we are reviewing today was intended to be accessible to anybody. You don't even have to be an academic, right? At the same time, we did the little we could to pay homage to all the work that our academic co-travelers have done in this field, right? So I think I take seriously all the questions that's been raised. I don't want to be the only one talking. In fact, I didn't want to speak at all. But I think we owe it to all of you to sort of give a little bit of the thinking around how we came to this book. We thought that beyond that academic deep dive that I said we had done with the Palgrave Handbook, that we wanted an accessible textbook that high schools on the continent can order, that government ministries of education can use, that also new graduate students. I sat down for a meeting on Friday with a new student that I accepted, and she was asking me, I want to use African feminist streams. What I haven't read, I don't really know much about it. This is the kind of book that I would say is a starting point for you to begin to know about it before you get into the really dense work. I appreciate everyone. Thank you so much. My mom is on the call, my sister is on the call, and I want to just acknowledge them for being here today. Usually these things happen in spaces where, again, my family are usually not part of it. And since this is Zoom, I thought for once or twice, let them also see what we do.
Yes.
Thank you very much. Back to the audience. And after this, I hope I will not speak again.
Okay. Thank you very much, Professor Jacob Haliso. And I say welcome to your mom and your family members here. It's really, really pleasant to see family members, and they come, they see us, and then they understand why we miss family meetings. I was busy studying, that's why. This is the work I was doing. That's why I didn't attend this program, or I've not been able to respond to your WhatsApp message for the past 5 days. So yes, thank you very much, and you are welcome. Now we go to the audience. We have 3 people who have raised up their hands. We'll call them and you ask your questions. Please direct it to any of the panelists if you want them to respond to your questions. And we'll start with Professor Eunice Ayereko Ajay, and then we'll go on to, Isaac Nana Kwaku Geman Dua, and then Dr. Faustina Uzwani, and then please one after the other. Let's go.
All right, thank you very much, Unisa Chekweje from KUST Ghana. And I haven't read the book, so I don't know whether it's been addressed. I just want to know your findings on whether men at the post-colonial era are ready for career women in marriage. Thank you.
Great question. And some of our panelists will help to answer that because their work covers that area. So yes, Isaac Nana Kwaku, please, you're up.
Right. So this question goes to Dr. Mary Owusu, and I want to ask, as a Ghanaian parent, how do you dialogue with your kids and especially your child, girl child or children, and how do you, as in, teach them as a Ghanaian and especially as Africa girl coming up? And question number 2, do we still have gender imbalance still in existence? And if yes, how do we treat that, or how do we go about it? And any of the panelists can also answer to that for me. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you. They will answer your question very shortly. Dr. Faustina Ozwani and then.
Hello, can you hear me?
Very well.
Okay. Thank you for hosting this very interesting academic expository, which is very germane during our own time. What interests me most was I recently conducted research on women in governance and peace building initiative in Enugu State. And the result I found was quite amazing. There is still this gap that is so alarming. Now we begin to wonder, all these conventions on the elimination of discrimination against women, the proposed adoption or domestication of all these policies on various states in Africa or nations, and the women interest in getting themselves involved in politics or other area of peace building where their service could be needed. Then you find out that despite all these things, these push factors and everything that have done in quotes to aid women participation, we still see this gap that begin to question the integrity, the steps that are being taken. How effective is these steps in ensuring inclusivity in diverse form? It calls for alarm because we work so much. Women are doing great work. Yet this there is underrepresentation, there is under-recognition, and the narrative have not changed. My question is, how can we, in which way can we look at in ensuring that these dynamics that still kept women where they are despite their push could be tackled so that their visibility in all these things can count in African narrative? Thank you.
Thank you very much. That's a great question, and we will throw it to our panelists who have done considerable research in these areas. The next question will come from Kemi Seriki. Good afternoon, and please unmute her.
Hello.
Hello, we can hear you now.
Okay, thank you so much for taking my call. Dr. Falola is always putting on a great conversation. And many times I listen, I don't get to participate. But I said this time I have to say something, and I ask question. One thing, I'm not in academia, but I love to read African history. And since I came to this country in United States, I've explored so many academic work. One thing that I see regarding African, in academia is that their work is not accessible. When I said accessibility, for everyone to read it, I don't have to have a PhD to understand your work. I've read Dr. Falola's book, Sometimes I read it twice because it is self-explanatory that anybody could get into it. But one thing I see in a lot of African academia and why their work is not being recognized is their style of writing. So when we're talking about colonization, they are part of those who are actually continue to colonize Africa in their work. So I want them to address that. Number two question that I have is regarding when we're talking about, we focus pointing finger on the colonial empire without looking at the religion aspect of things, whether we're talking about Islam or Christianity. Some Africans cannot even differentiate what is religion, what is culture. And they are not addressing that in their work. So those are the only two things I want to say.
Thank you very much for your questions. I'm going to we'll take a pause right now so that our panelists can respond, and anyone is free to respond to any of the questions, whichever one you want to provide an answer to, please go ahead and do that. So please help us to unmute all our panelists. Okay. Professor Idahosa, you're already unmuted. Please, anyone can go ahead. Yes.
Okay. I think the first question was really asking about my findings on my research on STEM, our first generation. That often bleeds into one another because my research on STEM, Black women or African women in STEM disciplines, they were also first generation women. I think maybe I would highlight 5 themes that kind of emerged from that study. And the first is typical. We know that the sense of unbelonging and exclusion, being in a space that is historically masculinized. And we see, I think, one of the things that it didn't come as a surprise, but more, I'll say as a surprise while conducting the interviews, was how traditional some of their Black male counterparts were towards them in terms of saying, "Oh, you have a pretty face," and you would be surprised that this is happening in 2020. You have a pretty face, you should go get married. And this is in a space that purports itself to be liberal and free and equal. So that's that feeling of unbelonging and being excluded and facing and encountering microaggressions, like being told that you're beautiful, you should go marry, or it should be difficult for you to find a husband. And it's only ugly girls that should be doing this. We also see the experience of tokenism and colorblind ideologies that kind of dismiss structural racism and sexism. Which means that their needs, their experiences are not attended to, not by institutional policies, not by the practices of their lecturers or their counterparts, their peers. We also see educational and linguistic differences, not necessarily barriers, as many first-generation students come from under-resourced schools. Some of them are taught in indigenous languages. And so making the transition to English-dominated universities makes engaging with the curriculum particularly difficult. And particularly, that project was looking at the construction of habitus and how it is not like that this student did not have what it takes to succeed or to engage or interact. It's just that they have developed a habitus that's very different from the academic field. And as part of succeeding, we see a lot of them understanding and learning what the academic habitus is, what academic language it looks like, what academic speak looks like, and being able to interact in that, but also merging their own knowledges, their own habitus, for lack of a better word, with the expectations within academia. We also see, by nature of the first generation status, some like financial and familial pressure. I'll just say one more thing about habitus. I think one of the papers we talked about how the development of an academic identity was also central to students succeeding. So seeing themselves as knowledge producers, seeing themselves as knowers was central to success. I'll go back to the findings about financial and familial pressures. These are not new. Literature talks about them. But in particular, within South African context, the question of Black tax and the expectation to financially support the families come as an added burden and pressure, particularly and has as a limitation to pursuing postgraduate studies. So you see a lot of the women talking about, and here I'm talking about the women who actually chose to go on and pursue their doctorates in STEM fields. Talk about the pressure and the difficulty with navigating that decision to whether to go to work or continue with their postgraduate studies, because they know that maybe they might not be as the family will not understand the reason why someone is deciding to pursue another 3-4 years of studying over bringing money to the family. And what this kind of encapsulates is just the idea of an intersectional burden of being simultaneously Black, African, female, first generation, which intensifies their marginalization or the feeling of unbelonging. And as they kind of embody a stark contrast to the somatic norm who is white, middle class, male. And so we see a lot of hypervisibility, but also invisibility and misrecognition in their interactions. Because my work is an agency, it is important to highlight these inequalities, but also highlight the strategies of resistance and persistence that these students are able, and also academics are able to overcome despite these constraints. So we see that they are able to draw on self-motivation. They are able to draw on their understanding, a quick understanding, a quick study of what is expected of them, of how the system works, and how they can use the system to their own benefit. I think one of the things that I'm beginning to explore is the problem with the idea of resilience and how you are expected to be resilient, but there is that puts the problem on the individual and doesn't necessarily highlight the structural conditions that pushes or forces one to be resilient. Yeah, so I would like leave that there. I'll let someone else speak and then come to the second question, which I think is really interesting I think it was something about, how did I write that down? Just give me a second. I think what it means to be a woman in Africa.
Yeah, thank you. We'll get back to that, yes. And let's take more questions. I think Professor Owusu, your name was also mentioned as part of the panelists. Thank you.
Thank you. So thank you very much for the question. That was Mr. Duya. Thank you very much. So yes, I wouldn't have mentioned that I do have children, but your question has forced me to bring the personal into this room. So I do have children. I have 3 boys and a girl. I have 4 children. And you wanted to know how my scholarship and the ways in which I raise my children intersect and the knowledges that I have. So on that level, in my home, as in my father's house and my mother's house, we really do not do girls' work and boys' work. I grew up washing my father's car. I grew up fixing things, and I continue to do that with my children. We all wash the dishes, boy, girl, everybody does that. So that's, and my mother, as I have the opportunity to talk about her, was the second person to head WAJU, the Women and Juvenile Unit of the Ghana Police Service. So that's the kind of background that I have that also shapes the ways in which I think about women and women's issues. So that is that. On that note too, I want to talk about how my personal philosophy of life shapes the work I do. So I am a Catholic Christian, and I teach at a Christian liberal arts university, the King's College. And those two things shape what I do. I am influenced by the 10 Commandments, the social doctrine of the Catholic Church, and Thomas A. Kempis's Imitation of Christ. In my daily life, in the work I do, I am informed by this. For example, the first 4 of the 10 Commandments concern our relationship with God, as far as I'm concerned, and the other 6 are about our relationship with others. And the church's social doctrine on that encapsulates the 6 commandments. So as a scholar, I am informed by a Christian linear progressive view, where I see history as meaningful and directed by a higher purpose. But I also see human beings as contingent, and that what we do not always allow a straight path in history. So I do not think that there is a determined end that we are going into. So for me, my Christian perspective, I integrate that to how I teach and how I research. And so the question on what does it mean to be woman is shaped by that. What does it mean to be woman is shaped by my knowledge of the imitation of Christ, my knowledge of the commandments, the 10 commandments, and also my knowledge of indigenous knowledge systems. I come from a long tradition of strong women, vibrant women. My grandmother did not do formal education. She sold bushmeat in the Kumasi market. She upheld human dignity. So I do that too. And she, in fact, shaped how I think about history, about the violence of the state. Because when I really think deeply about why I became a historian, I think I was informed by an interaction with her, where I asked about a certain person in Ghanaian history, Kobeduse. And she said to me, "Oh, that ugly man with a big mouth." And then in the night, she woke me up and said, "Hey, do you remember the conversation we had?" I said, "Yes." "You can never tell anybody, otherwise they will take me away." And this person I asked about was someone who was dead and gone, whose presence in government was in the 1960s. And at this time in history, I was doing my secondary education at St. Louis Secondary School. This is the 90s, early 90s. And so for her to wake me up, try to convince me, and then in the morning, re-emphasize I cannot have the conversation with anyone, shaped my understanding of the coercive powers of the state and how it shaped how people lived their lives and functioned. And so I do talk about marginalized voices in the work that I do. And I want to go on to the question of, is there a unique one way of thinking about feminism? No. Every historian will tell you there are many philosophies of histories, and there are many, many definitions of feminism. I think as Simon Mary, Dr. Simon Mary did say, we also do not want to conflate how we think about these topics from the colonial perspective and how we think about them in the post-colonial and in our now, right? But I think that in the end, whether you are a follower of indigenous knowledge systems, you are a follower of Christianity, which is my primary religion, Islam, whatever, there is a certain duty to uphold human dignity and a moral responsibility that asks us to be true to the issues that we are addressing. And for me, that is what shapes my work. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Owusu. I really appreciate that, because in answering that question, you've also answered the question about religion, right? How does religion contribute to all these aspects? And you have brought in this very positive view of what religion can really achieve. It's an ambivalent resource that can go either way, and I'm very grateful the way you've explained this. Professor Vogt-William, you've done so much work on colonialism and women, and do you want to take the question on the coloniality of imagination and how it frames a particular idea of woman that we are running up against in contemporary times?
Yes, that would have been part of my last two slides, basically. But yeah, fair enough. Yeah, that coloniality of imagination, it's going to be very much sort of informed by the coloniality of gender. I mean, if we want to look at the context of respectability politics, and this is also implicitly addressed in the chapter on gendered sexualities, right? What is being privileged there is intrinsically a very, very cis heteronormative framework. And if we look below the surface, you might also see the echoes of Victorian ideals that are being transported, right? I mean, this is also part of that privileging of that heterosexual, heteronormative framework that Maria Lugones has been talking about, right? And which also kind of shapes the idea of where woman's place is in the home, in these particular prescribed ideas of wifehood and mothering particularly. So if we have, you know, a context where single mother households suddenly are being addressed, where does that particular form of agency for that African woman who is the mother, who is the breadwinner, who, you know, manages her household, manages the family's relationships with the community on the outside, where do we locate her agency? Where do we locate her respectability? Yeah, I mean, this idea of being respectable is also transported within that coloniality of imagination as regards what woman's space is and what men's space are, right? And I'd like to just sort of take a wild leap of that very imagination again and try and push this into the space and the framework of higher education, basically trying to riff off of what Dr. Idahosa has basically been trying to explain to us, right? I mean, somebody like Owina Okech, who says in her Critical African Studies article from 2015, African Feminist Communities and Decoloniality, she points out how universities have become spaces where they are invested overtly and covertly in masculinized notions of man as thinker, man as aggressive debater, and in turn thinker as man and debater as man. So let's extend that to a more gendered imagination of what African citizenship can be. Every time we talk about citizenship, every time we talk about the types of agency that's transported in that ideal of African citizenship, it's always an androcentric, masculinized model. So that in itself needs to be interrogated when we want to, you know, sort of reimagine what it means to be African. And does it then allow for African feminist work, African women's work, and their own reimaginations of what the coloniality of gender is, right? Okay, and here I'd like to draw that interesting sort of way of thinking into the idea of African women writers, where in this particular chapter here, in chapter 20, the question of feminist theorizations as informing African women's writerly creativity. Yeah, producing languages of the imagination. Yeah, and I'm thinking of people like Taiye Selassie. I'm thinking of people like Nnedi Okorafor. I'm also riffing off of Chimamanda Adichie's idea that we should all be feminists, because there is always a danger in the single story. And here again, how these intersectional complexities, although there are African scholars who hate intersectionality because it's supposed to only come from the African-American context, and that's got nothing to do with the continent. But then again, I would then want to access Olajumoke Yacob Haliso's 2025 article on African intersectionalities, which then sets up another interesting complex of thought processes of how we can rethink that coloniality of imagination, interrogate it, and then pull out those exciting nuggets of Afro-feminist knowledge that is going to help us to envision a future where African women scholars, African women knowledge producers, African women artists, African women students and researchers will reclaim their time, reclaim their space, and set up their visibility and raise their voices. That is the vision that I would be happy to work towards. Being non-African, I am interested in conversations, unfinished conversations. This book, which has silences and gaps, just offers the potential of further nodes of connection, further nodes of building communities of practice, communities of thought, and further modes of re-envisioning what it means to be African and reproducing, or rather reclaiming, a slightly different coloniality of imagination that dismantles the coloniality of gender and the violences that it brings with it. Forgive me, my enthusiasm. It is something.
No, it's very infectious. Your enthusiasm has infected me, and it feels very good. Thank you very much. That's very inspiring. I had two people raise up their hands. I will call Cynthia Unilag. She had her hand raised. I'm sorry, I don't know your last name, so please say it when you come on. Professor Haliso has a hand raised, so yes, you too, you get to speak. Please go ahead.
Yeah, I don't know if Cynthia is still on the call. No. Okay. Because maybe after this, there may not be an opportunity to speak again. Yeah, I think I just wanted to, shall I say, just say the same thing my dear colleagues have said, just in a different way in terms of what does it mean to be a woman in the African context? And is there a definition of feminism in Africa? These big questions, my own controversial response always is, and you'll find it in the introduction to this book, always is there isn't one answer to those questions. There are over 500 million women on the African continent. You cannot expect them all to fit in one box. And I think that sometimes our resistance to feminism as a word is because we have this unidimensional, flat vision of what being woman means in the African context, or what feminism means in the African context. And I am very happy, like Professor Vogt-William said, to have unfinished conversations. In other words, to have concepts that defy tidy definitions, that allow us to continue to engage, reshape, and to continue to think and imagine beyond what is known now, so that we do not have a field that becomes irrelevant in the next moment. And I think that links again to the moderator's question about why some women today are repudiating the label of feminism. They'd rather be trad wives. They want to live the soft life. Hey, do what works for you. In my opinion, you're still welcome. I'm still going to advocate for you, for your rights, for your humanity, for your citizenship, for your choice, whatever it may be. So that expansive view, in my opinion, also meets resistance amongst some African feminists and amongst the academy more broadly. But I think it's the way to think about the future, to have that elasticity of cognition about African women and gender and what all these things mean. Any meanings assigned today, in my opinion, apply more to the person giving that definition than to the world out there, frankly speaking. It often says a lot. And I wanted to tie that with Khushi's comments about how we may be speaking about African women and using one another even as examples, but we are also international actors. In other words, that we are all connected, and the things we do and think and theorize about connect with broader systems of thought, broader flows of history that we need. As scholars, we are better able to appreciate that sometimes, and sometimes we also have blind spots in how these issues are connected together. And that's, again, to just land on the Natasha Akpoti-Uduaghan issue in the Nigerian Senate. Again, we're on the defensive all the time because we take one step forward and 5 steps backward every time. And let me quickly say that on the entire African continent, Nigeria is at the very bottom of the leagues when it comes to numbers of women in parliament. At the very bottom, the most populous nation in the world, the in quotes, largest democracy on Africa, the most populous nation in Africa and the largest democracy in quotes in Africa, and yet women are so excluded in the formal spaces. How much more the informal spaces? So there's still a lot of work to do, and we do that. And I wanted to link that also with the comments that one of our colleagues made about how our academic work is inaccessible a lot of times. Because if we do this only in our hallowed academic boxes, then we cannot change the world that we study. We cannot make a difference. Of course, I understand that not all of us need to have the vision to change the world, but I think that when we study women in Africa, the potential to link that with women's struggles outside the classroom is far more elastic and broader. And in fact, we cannot understand anything in the classroom unless we take on board the struggles of women outside the classroom when it comes to studying African women. And perhaps this is a lead into the end of our discussion, the question of our academic work being accessible. I have worked with Professor Falola for quite a while now, and that is one of the things I have learned from him. Because like many of you, I was schooled in the colonial British mindset of a thing, an institution that has a colonial fixation, and we find this across the continent in many different ways. And that formality in the way we're taught to think and to write used to be a big part of me, right? But this book we're reading is accessible, I would say, mostly because Professor Falola is part of it and actually is the leader of the project from the very beginning. That's just one thing. If we were able to seamlessly weave the political, the social, the cultural, the historical, and the contemporary and all that, it's also from learning from how he writes. And that's to say that the work we're discussing today, as somebody rightly said, is the product of his 70+ years of doing this kind of thing. That's what makes it such a fantastic book. It's not my own ideas about feminism or about African women, but then we are able to access this work drawing on his ages-old wisdom, so to speak. And I hope that he's still online and he can say something before we all leave.
Okay, so we have like several people who have had their hands raised for a while. So we take the questions and then we start to go to the end. Cynthia Unilag, if you are here, I'm sorry that we've taken so much of your time, but you go first. And then followed by Temitope Fagunwa. And the third person, look, as they dropped out, Bukodel. Sorry, I don't know your name, but please know that I recognize you. And then the last person will be Bukola Adekoya Fagbinle. And then please direct the questions to our panelists and they will take the questions one after the other. So let's start with Cynthia Unilag.
Good evening, all. Thank you so much for this great opportunity. In fact, my question was almost touched by our great professor. I want to talk about the issue of Nigerian patriarchy, touching on the Senator Natasha issue. I don't just see it as the males against the females. I also see a situation where the women themselves are against, fellow women. You see some of the northern women were, accused Natasha of arm twisting and blackmailing the senator. So you see a situation in Nigeria where other women, a woman wants to rise up and some others are looking at her. You're a feminist. You're a feminist is like an insult. So how do you approach this? I'm coming from a place where I can count. I don't think in my village or in my town, we have about up to 3 doctors. You have the men, especially in the southeastern part of Nigeria. In some, I don't know, from Enugu to be precise, you see that some women try to rise, but you see the men, what else do you want to do in school? You've gotten a bachelor is enough for you. So I think I've asked two questions in one now. How do we do this? How do we, come out as feminists without being apologetic about it? I just finished the program in Unilag, and some people in my class, me being a feminist was that I like to ask questions. You see, some people want to bring you down, as in you shouldn't speak. Your voice have to tone. I don't know this submission, the religious aspect of you have to be submissive is not just at home. As a woman, you have to also be submissive to all men in the society. I think the religious aspect also plays a huge role in this patriarchy system, especially found in Nigeria. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We go to Temitope Fagunwa. Please be unmuted and.
Can I be heard?
Yes, we can hear you.
Yes, thank you very much. Firstly, I want to thank our panelists for the interesting discussion. I've been able to deduce important points around the question of women's struggle on the African continent. And congratulations also on the book publication. And I think that we must consistently have such books, books that encompasses or the experiences, narrate the experiences of our women, from a very Pan-African perspective. I want to say that moving forward, I think that there's a necessity for us to also begin to articulate the role of our institutions, in the continuous exploitation and oppression of our women. And why this is very, very important is because within the African continent, we recently came across a report that says that the continent is the least continent, that wherein the educational sector is being taken as a form of investment. That is a continent where education is least being invested in by members of the ruling class. And what this means is that, the question of girl child education, you can bet, you can be rest assured that, that's a crisis that we need to confront, on that basis because of this, recent report that we are dealing with. Our institutions, rest the bulwark of the operation, the continuous existence of, the society at which you're living in right now, lies in the continuous operation of our women, and our institutions, play a leading role in all of these things. I think there's and when we talk about institutions, beyond what we see on the surface, within the university environment also, we are talking about an institution. Back at the university some times ago, I was part of a group of colleagues that were able to discern an element of anti-woman practice, wherein the management released a report that staff members cannot have their newborns in the office, when in actual fact you do not have an existing daycare. So this thing speaks about how our institutions itself proliferate all of these ideas. We must begin to take our institutions to the podium of questioning if need be, so that we can begin to design the necessary ways to to talk about the
Thank
liberation
you.
of our women. Thank you very
Yeah,
much.
thank you very much. We really appreciate that. The last person is Bukola Adekoya Fagbele. Please go straight to the point and ask your question. Thank you.
Hello, good evening. Thank you so much for this opportunity to be part of this. I've not read the book, obviously. I just want to know if you've you considered the role of medical herbalists, especially female ones in Nigeria or in Africa. I am one, and I find that I'm always a minority everywhere because I'm not well represented at all. And same thing goes for research books about herbal medicine in Nigeria. I find that we always have to look outwards, and we need to start reversing this trend of writing books for our people, books about herbal medicine, books about our women, books that empower us as individuals, and use words that are more African based. I don't know about feminism, okay? I don't know if we understand that in the African sense, in the real African sense. We had matriarchy. We had that what ruled before patriarchy. We're not even using any of that. So I won't go on and on. And then religion as well. Please, somebody mentioned religions versus culture. It's all embedded somehow. We need to be able to differentiate between spirituality, African spirituality, and Abrahamic religion. You can be everything. You can be a Christian, you can be a pagan, you can be a Muslim. But please, let's not forget our culture. Let's not forget how we all started as women. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So we go to the panelists who will get to respond to some of the questions and also provide their own closing statement. I wish that you will address issue of accessibility, not only just as a matter of language, but also as an economic factor, right? Accessibility, yes, it's good to speak in language that anybody can read. It's not too academic, not too full of jargonese. But again, as scholars, many of us based, in different parts of the world, do we also exclude people that need to read us because books are expensive? So that's also another angle to think of accessibility. And so we will go again, and this time we start with Professor Rathore, and we'll go to Professor Tinuade Ojo, Professor Owusu, Professor Idahosa, Professor Vogt-William, and Professor Agbalajobi. You will take the rear this time. And so, yes, you have 1 to 2 minutes to respond and to provide your closing statement. Thank you.
Thank you so much. One, I just want to say, Professor Vogt-William, I think I will use your phrase of thinking with unfinished conversations very so often after this. So I want your permission to quote you on that. I find that incredibly inspiring.
Actually, it's not from me. It's from Stuart Hall and John Akomfra. It's not from me.
Okay. But so that's my knowledge gap, which has been filled right now. But I wanted to just caution a little bit, and of course, as I said, I'm not an expert, on women in Africa. But usually, and there was a question on what has colonialism done to being a woman in colonized landscapes, right? I think that is also a question that we need to tread with very carefully in the age of hypernationalism, because it's not the first time that gender has been made subservient to nationalism. It happened even during the period of decolonization. And that has somewhere to speak to the reason of why we do not read of these stories of nation building, why these stories become women's history and not national history, why they become social history, but not international history and diplomatic history. So I think it's very important that when we engage with what has colonialism done to us as people of any colonized landscape, we have to be cautious that we do not lose our perspective to interrogate power, because that is primarily from where we are coming from,
right.
To this conversation.
And yes, and especially also because when we are rewriting these histories, and I'm saying this more as a historiographical, position, perspective. Many a times when we are rewriting these histories, we're also rewriting histories of elite women, and we many a times end up, forefronting that. I write histories of elite Indian women who were great anti-imperialists and who wrote great work, but who also came with certain privileges which an everyday life did not permit. And I think those are the stories which I am very, very interested in, to address my own blind spots also. I would, in the interest of time, I would stop over here. But thank you so much for having me on this panel. It's been incredibly enriching and inspiring.
Thank you very much, Professor Rathore. Great insights. Thank you for sharing them. Professor Ojo.
So much. Many things have been said, and like my colleagues have said, all these issues are deep and nuanced, right? Like Prof. Jumi have said. And in fact, in my center, we're about to look and redefine the concept of intersectionality within the African context, right? What does race, class, gender, how does this really impact, women dynamics within the African system? So for every question that I've come through on what is the redefinition, I was even asking my master's student in class yesterday, to what extent has African feminism, right, really realized, or has its own impact when it comes to the concept of identity, sense of belonging, like Prof. Idahosa have said, and so on and so forth. Have we really achieved what we really want to do? And back to the question I was asking earlier, some people have been talking about these case studies in Nigeria and different African settings on women inclusivity, accessibility, right? Representation. Like Prof. Jumi was saying, gender index, Nigeria is actually on 313 this year, right? On gender index, when it comes to women parliamentary representation. So we are way far behind. We can't go into all those dynamics now. So there are a lot of things that we really need to look, questions that we really need to look, nuances that needs to be redefined in its own perspective so that we can understand this. And I also agree with fellow colleagues that the act of writing in itself needs to be redefined, right? We need to be able to simplify things. And yes, we academics, we acknowledge we have a lot of grammars, right? We have lots of literature, the content and the way we bring out, all these dynamics are too complex, for the society. So yes, we need as a body to start thinking on how to simplify this. Because someone asked the question, is there still gender imbalance? I don't know if you saw my expression that time. I was like, okay, what? Right? So the fact that that question was asked is even a question that we need to redefine in itself is problematic, right? UN says it's going to take 365 years for us to reach gender parity. And I always ask, how long is it going to take Africa? Because that's within the global sector. So these are many more questions that we need to ask ourselves. Time has gone. I just want to say in conclusion, this book is a prolific contribution, not only to African studies, but to the global discourse in itself, because it tells us that centering women's voices is not optional, but it is an essential for a just and inclusive future. So thank you once again to Professor Falola, Professor Owusu Yakub for gifting us this important work, and to every organizers that have convened this important dialogue. Thank you so much, and thank you for having me. Thank you.
Very much. Thank you very much, Professor Ojo. Professor Owusu?
Thank you. In my final reflection, I also want to think through Akan women. That's what I am familiar with. I identify as an Akan woman. And as I mentioned earlier about my own grandmother, who was a trader. and how she's shaped my life and that of others. So I think through how sometimes, again, going to what Professor Rathore was mentioning about how we must take a pause when we center colonial rule and coloniality of things, to also think through what I think of as ideas and how they have been socially constructed over time. The language that we use and how they have actually changed meaning over time. So, for example, a word like race, we all know what it means. But what if I told you that at some point there was the Germanic races, which really is not about how we conventionally think of race through color. And within our own local histories, I was very, very, it took me a while to actually understand, the N word in terms of how it is used by authors in the 1800s. As I studied those who were writing, Africans who were writing in the 1860s, they made a distinction between the interior African and the coastal African. And more often than not, the N word was used for the coastal African. The interior African was seen to be, interior. I have friends who tease me that I am from the Hinties, from the hinterland. I am from the interior part of it. So for me, it is that the ideas we have, the language that we used, we must be aware that at certain times in history, they actually probably meant different things to what we are using now. And that then takes me back to the Akan woman, who, for me, as I discovered, being of matrilineal stock, had such power, which sometimes is erased when powerlessness is what you read more about. And so for me, it is sometimes even the power of no voice as opposed to the power of voice. And that is how I think that going forward, when we write, we must pay attention to the words we are using. We must pay attention to the context of the thoughts we are expressing. And I'll end with arguably the most famous Ghanaian, at least in 1927, Kweji Agri, who says, if you teach a woman through the education system, Agri talks about the black keys and the white keys, how the two make a beautiful sound on the piano. But he also talks about education and says, if you teach a woman, you educate a nation. And it has been said in various ways in Ghana. People say it all the time. When you invite people, well, used to when I was growing up, when you invited people, they would say, as Agri said, if you educate a woman, you educate a nation. But what do we mean when we say these things? Does a woman need to be educated? Why aren't we thinking of some of these things that we say? Anyway, thank you very much for being here. Thank you, Professor Falola and Professor Jacob Halisu. And thank you for making me think through, the work I'm doing through your work. And as I said, the work that you have done is really an in for many of us and for our students to think through various topics, the ones you have raised and the ones you were silent about. Thank you.
Thank you. Professor Idahosa?
Thank you, everyone, and thank you, Professor Yakob Haliso and Professor Falola for this. I would try to keep my response simple. I always try to do that. I think I will limit my response to maybe two things, and one is just listening to the conversations and the questions, particularly as it relates to women being complicit in their own oppression, as it relates to the question on whether men are ready for career women, which is a tricky question to answer and to think through. That would require a lot of time to unpack. But in thinking through how to respond to that, I was just struck by how this is where education is important, and not just formal education. Education is informal form. So the way in which social media or the media can contribute to educating citizens and individuals about equality and how women should be able to present themselves in whatever forms that they wish to. I think one of the problems that we have, and one of the problems I had while I was in Nigeria, was how I was constantly made to feel like there was something that was not necessarily feminine, and that I needed to adapt to this feminine like version of myself. And I remember I did my undergrad at Redeemers University, which was very conservative and which really pushed me in the direction of the work that I do now. And they were always, oh, you have to be in a particular, or speak in a particular way. Don't raise your voice. Don't push back on things. You need to be pious so that you can get married. And I remember at some point I just got frustrated. I'm like, if that's the case, then I don't want to get married, because I want to be who I want to be who I want to be, and the version of myself I want to be. And it was not until I left Nigeria to South Africa that the language of structural inequality and the way in which power works, and power works over the body, and the techniques of the body, came to help understand the problems I was having at that time. But back to what I was going to say is the importance of education, not just in the formalized modes, but also in informal modes. I think change is not going to be sudden. I think this is why we ask the question whether anything has changed, since we still see women excluded today. But it is slow, and we need to be persistent with it. And these small micro actions of understanding our histories. Like the other day, my mom was telling me that in her family, they don't historically never married and went to their husband's house. They married, gave birth, and brought their children to their grandmother. And I thought it was powerful, because I'm like, yes, this is really what I want to do. Maybe I shouldn't have said that.
Yeah.
But understanding our histories, understanding our lineage would also help to understand why it's important for women to be able to represent and fully express themselves. I want to go just one more comment in response to the question of accessibility and language, and being able to read and engage people's text. And I think that's one thing that's driven me primarily to be able to engage and write in a way that is plain and easy to be understood and accessed. I remember my doctoral supervisor saying, you must be able to explain your theory to your grandmother. If you cannot do that, then you don't understand what it is you're saying. And that has really driven me. But there's also a tension in that, to be able to get legitimacy and recognition within academia, you need to have the academic speak, the linguistic ability to be able to engage these or to get any kind of recognition. And so there is that tension. Spivak says that plain prose cheats. And I think it's in the preface of Pedagogy of the Oppressed. I can't remember who wrote that talks about plain prose. He extends and says plain prose also bleaches, because you're not able to convey the weight of the theory and the history of oppression and the complexity of what you're trying to uncover or you're trying to talk about in prose. But I think it's just maintaining a fine balance and recognizing that maybe we're not really speaking only to an academic audience, but find ways of also speaking to a non-academic audience. And one of the ways I do that with my project now is to have my papers, but also have a podcast that really just talks about everyday experiences in academia, and maybe individuals outside academia can connect to that. I'll finalize and say thank you for having me here. It's been an exciting and thought-provoking conversation with the panelists. But also I want to thank Professor Yakob and Professor Falola for inviting me, and also to our moderator. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
I think someone needs to also say that our moderator writes a popular column every week that's it's always very finely nuanced and sophisticated, but in incredibly accessible language. Again, just another way that we can make our thoughts. I mean, we all do it in different ways, but I know she won't say it herself, but she's also a master of this thing we're talking about.
Thank you very much. I appreciate that. Professor Vogt-William.
Yeah, thank you. I'd like to also just sort of briefly address the question of power and how that actually works in how lives are being arranged and how worlds are being made. And here I would draw attention to how the types of cultural, structural, disciplinary, and interpersonal power relations have basically marked the ways in which knowledges are being produced. And I think several of the points brought up by our colleagues here have also pointed out implicitly how these particular arenas of power actually work. Of course, many other arenas are also in action. Having said that, I'd also like to point out something as a gender studies scholar, that very often in higher education sort of context, in knowledge production context, the question of gender is very often sort of sidelined. Oh, that's just a social construct. Can I just point out how that social construct is very, very instrumental in how power is exercised? Despite the fact that that question of social construct, it actually affects realities, right? It actually affects how we as women also see the world, right? So again, here, I'd also like to bring in the question of situated knowledges. We have dealt with specific situated knowledges here coming from different African perspectives, and very, very strong African feminist perspectives as well. Which then also brings me down to this one question of language. Very often within the book, I noticed the word female was used. And that word has been used here in the discussion very often. Female first generation, female researchers. Given that gender identities are social, cultural, biological, I was rather disturbed to hear that biological term female consistently mobilized. I'm wondering whether or not it is possible for us to expand our terminologies and sort of bring in the complexity of the figure of the woman rather than the female. Just a thought. And speaking of language, the accessibility of language in how our texts are laid out as academics who also engage in forms of academic activism. This is also an area where power is exercised. What exactly are we trying to communicate? And to what end? Is our academic work meant to be in dialogue, in conversation with the world around us? Who are we addressing? Who would we like to be in dialogue with? Whose agencies are we trying to tap into in the ways of uplift and empowerment? Are we prepared to ask uncomfortable questions which push towards modes of political and epistemic justice? While we are not interested in consistently having to justify our presences, justify our knowledges, justify our histories, and justify our work, still the necessity of justice is still there. I'm sure we all will agree to that point, and we'll approach it from different trajectories.
Thank
So
you.
what exactly is our work meant to contribute to this project of world making? What are the visions of the world that we want as feminists of color scholars, as Black feminists, as African feminist scholars, both from the continent as well as from the diaspora? Are we looking towards a more life-affirming complexity of our world, where everybody has some space to talk, to breathe, and to, of course, produce knowledge, necessary conversations? Thank you so much. Thank you for your patience. This has been marvelous, and I have learned a lot. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Professor Agbalajobi.
Yeah, thank you very much. I will say three things, and I'll try to explain. First is the fact that power for me is negotiated and not given. And as African women in Africa, I think we keep having to negotiate for our power. And I'm trying to understand this from the political settlement framework, and I think it's very important for us to know that. And secondly is the fact that gender is political, not just social. And also that the urban space are battlegrounds for inclusion, rights, and recognition. And when I say that power is negotiated, it means that as women, we have to, power is not negotiated, not given to us. Then women must become strategic negotiators within the system that kind of exclude us. We find a way of navigating through these challenges. And some of the things have been explained in the book, and we keep working through those different mediums, navigating life challenges within the agency that we use so that we can get the power that we need. And of course, the fact that gender is political and not just social, it means that the gender roles, the identities and relations are shaped by power structures, not just cultural norms or traditions. So this shift in perspective has a kind of profound implication on how we understand women's dynamic in Africa. And I think that's where I want to start. I want to sincerely thank Professor Falola and Mr. Aliso for giving me this opportunity to be a part of this great panel. A lot of the women here have been citing them, but I never had the opportunity of meeting them in person, though virtual, but I'm grateful for this privilege. Thank you very much for this great delegation.
Thank you. Thank you very much to Professor Agbalajobi. Thanks to all the panelists together. And the last item on the agenda today is the vote of thanks. We want to thank everyone, and to do that will be Dr. Toyin Falola himself, who has been recluse throughout, but who will give us the vote of thanks. Prof, you're up now.
Well, thank you all the members of the panelists. It's been extremely enjoyable, academic. So what is next? The media are here, 5 medias have joined. I don't know their take. We won't know their take until Tuesday. Second, I do my own analysis of what you have said, which I will write during the week, and we circulate it globally. Third, by Wednesday or Thursday, we'll be able to know the number of people who have viewed this. The Zoom is just used to stream to other 21 countries. We usually do not even count the number on the Zoom as part of the audience, because they join on YouTube and television and radio stations, and they will feed us about the number. In the next 2 minutes, we will release the entire transcript. Please share this transcript, send them to your students. October 5, we are talking about women and slavery. A little bit depressing from what you have been talking about. Last time we spoke about women in STEM, today women in Africa. October 5, women and slavery, historically and at the current moment. And we invite you to please join. To all the members of the panel, please, you have suggested some topics, and the idea is that you should write on them. new ideas from Mary, who is now going to write a book on this. And Professor Ojo suggested that the center will be rethinking this subject along intersectionality. The challenge by Christine, why are we using female? That's incredible. And the notion of fight for power by Professor Agbalajobi, and the globalization of the field. The point that Professor Rathore made, that we have to see this topic not just in terms of its national framing, but in terms of its internationalism. Thank you all. We play music for those of you who love the music. And if you like the selection that we've made for this program, we'll send the selection to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
We wish you all the best in your various career. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Prof.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ola.
Yes.
Thank you.